after 3 weeks away. I had been home less than an hour when my wife asked me not to call her doctor. My son said the new medicine had simply upset her stomach. I opened the garage camera anyway. At 4:03 a.m., a woman in scrubs handed someone a silver pharmacy bag and carried my wife's original pill bottles away. I appreciate you being here with me. One small thing before we start. Leave a comment and let me know. Have you ever trusted someone with an elderly parent's care and later wondered if you should have? Checked more closely, yes or no? I read every one. Certain details in this story have been adjusted for narrative purposes. The message behind it is what I hope stays with you. I drove 300 miles picturing my wife in the garden, her sun hat, her dirty gloves, the way she'd straighten up slow when she heard my truck. And every single detail I imagined was wrong. 3 weeks I'd been gone. Las Cruces, New Mexico. Restoring high-voltage lines, an ice storm had ripped off their poles like paper streamers. That's what I do. What I've done for 36 years. My name is Virgil Prescott. I'm 67 years old, and I've spent most of my working life climbing 60-foot poles in weather that would keep a sensible man indoors. The job takes me away for weeks at a time, always has. Lorraine understood that before she married me. And in 41 years, she never once complained about it. She had her garden. She had her routine. She had the kind of independence that doesn't need to announce itself. So when I turned onto our road outside Mesa that October afternoon, windows down, dust and dry air coating my tongue, I expected the usual. October light on the backyard garden. Tomatoes coming in late. Lorraine waving from the side gate, with one glove still on, the way she always did. Like taking it off would waste time she could spend planting. I honked twice, pulling into the driveway. That's our signal. Has been for decades. Nobody came out. The garden was the first thing I saw, and it stopped me in the driveway with my keys still in my hand. The tomato cages were leaning sideways. Split fruit hung rotting in the heat, dark and caved in. The basil had gone to seed. The hose lay coiled by the spigot, bone dry, like it hadn't been touched in weeks. Lorraine Prescott, the woman who once hauled 50-pound bags of gravel across this yard without asking a soul for help, had let her garden die. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air hit me like a wall. Stale. Sealed. Every window in the house had been shut tight in Arizona heat, and the place smelled like nobody had opened a door in days. The kitchen light was on, which was wrong for mid-afternoon. Lorraine never wasted electricity in daylight. I found her standing at the kitchen counter, both hands gripping the edge, knuckles white. She was wearing a house dress I didn't recognize, and she had lost at least 10 pounds, maybe more. Her collarbone stood out like wire under her skin. Her eyes were too large for her face. I have climbed 60-foot poles in ice storms without my hands shaking. They were shaking now. Lorraine? I set my bag down by the door. What happened to the garden? She looked at me like she wasn't sure I was real. Her lips moved before the sound came out. You're home. Not a greeting. A confirmation. She said it the way someone identifies a sound in the dark, checking, not celebrating. Her fingers didn't loosen on the counter. She didn't step toward me. The woman who used to cross a room in 3 strides to put her arms around me after a long job stood 6 feet away and held on to the counter like it was the only steady thing left in her world. I crossed the kitchen and put my hand on her shoulder. She was cold, in a house that had to be 90 degrees with every window sealed. Her skin was cold to the touch. I could feel the bones beneath her shirt. I'm calling Dr. Myers, I said, reaching for my phone. You think you know your wife after 41 years. You think you've seen every version of her face. You haven't. What came over Lorraine's face in that moment was something I had never seen, not in 41 years of marriage, not through miscarriages or funerals, or the night our son broke his arm in 2 places falling off a tractor. This was not pain. This was not sadness. This was terror. Raw, airless, cornered animal terror. She grabbed my wrist. Not touched, grabbed. Her fingers dug in hard enough to leave marks I'd still see the next morning. For a woman who could barely stand, the strength in that grip was terrifying. Please. Her voice cracked on the word.
James, Baddock Club.
Please don't call him. Promise me you won't call him.
Hello.
Lorraine, you can barely stand. If you call that office, she'll know you're please. Please. She. Not he, the doctor. She. Someone else was on the other end of that number. And my wife was more afraid of her than of whatever was hollowing her out from the inside. I put the phone down. I didn't understand yet. But I knew 2 things. Lorraine was not just sick, and whatever had happened in this house while I was gone, it hadn't happened by accident. I let go of her wrist and saw the bruise I'd already left. That's how thin her skin had become in 21 days. I eased her into a kitchen chair, filled a glass of water from the tap, and set it in front of her. She drank it like she hadn't had a full glass in hours. Maybe she hadn't. I didn't sit down. I walked the house the way I walk a storm route, systematic. 1 section at a time, cataloging damage before I let myself feel any of it. The kitchen first. I opened the refrigerator, and the smell hit me before the light did. Spoiled milk. 3 yogurts 2 weeks past their date. A drawer of produce that had turned to liquid in its plastic bags. Nothing else. No meals. No leftovers. No evidence that anyone had cooked in this kitchen or brought food into this house in weeks. The pantry had half a box of crackers and a tin of coffee grounds. I made a pot because I needed something to do with my hands. It tasted bitter and stale. The kind of coffee that's been sitting open too long. The living room was untouched cushions in place, remote on the arm of the couch, a thin layer of dust on the television screen. The bathroom was where I stopped. Lorraine's scale. The small white one she kept next to the vanity was sitting by the back door. Not in the bathroom, by the back door, as if someone had been weighing themselves on the way out, checking a number they were tracking. Or as if someone had moved it there so Lorraine couldn't see what she'd lost. I've surveyed storm damage for 36 years. You learn to read what's salvageable and what's already gone. My wife's house looked like a scene she'd survived alone, without help, while someone was supposedly visiting every single day. I walked back to the hallway and found Lorraine trying to make it to the bedroom on her own. She had both hands on the wall, shoulder pressed flat against the plaster, sliding her feet forward one at a time like the floor might give out. This was the woman who hauled gravel bags across the yard last spring without breaking stride. Now she couldn't cross 12 feet of hallway without bracing against the wall. "I can do it," she said without looking at me. "Don't help me." She said it like she'd been practicing the sentence for weeks, like refusing help was the only dignity she had left. I stayed 2 steps behind her and didn't touch her. She made it to the bed and sat down on the edge, winded. I pulled a blanket over her shoulders and told her I'd be on the back porch if she needed me. She was asleep before I closed the door. I stepped outside into the dry evening air and called my son. Garrett Prescott is 37, a pipeline welder who follows contracts from state to state the way I follow storm damage. He picked up on the second ring, and the first words out of his mouth told me everything I needed to know. "Dad, hey, Mom's fine. Celeste has been there every single day." I hadn't asked about Celeste. I hadn't asked about anything yet. He was already answering questions I hadn't posed, in a voice that was too smooth, too steady, too prepared. She lost at least 10 pounds. Garrett, the fridge is empty. The garden's dead. The new doctor adjusted her blood pressure medication a couple weeks ago. Celeste says the side effects just need time to level out. It's temporary. When did my son start talking like a medical brochure instead of a welder? Level out, I repeated. That's the phrase you're using. That's just what's happening. Dad, Celeste has been managing it. She's been there every day, checking on Mom, making sure she takes her pills on time. Every answer came fast. Too fast. The kind of fast that doesn't come from knowing, it comes from rehearsal. My son loves his mother. If he'd seen her the way I just saw her, he would have driven a Mesa himself. He hadn't seen her. He'd been told what to believe. And the person who told him had given him the exact words to repeat. I thanked him and hung up. I stood on the back porch in the dark for a long time. The desert was quiet. The coffee had gone cold in my hand. My son had just told me everything was fine, and every word of it had been someone else's. Celeste had been feeding him lines, and the question I couldn't stop turning over was simple. Why would someone who was only helping her mother-in-law need a cover-up story at all?
Hey, lady,
unless the help wasn't help. Unless the visits weren't visits. Unless every daily check-in was something else entirely. And my wife knew it. And that was why she'd begged me not to make that call. I couldn't sleep. Garrett's borrowed phrases kept replaying, too smooth, too rehearsed. So I did what I've done after every storm for 36 years. I went to the garage and started looking for damage. The garage smelled like motor oil and concrete dust. I sat on the shop stool, pulled out my phone, and opened the security camera app. Motion triggered, mounted above the garage door, pointed at the driveway. 3 weeks of absence meant hundreds of clips. I started from the day I left and scrolled forward. The first few days were nothing. A delivery truck, the mail carrier. Then Celeste's blue SUV appeared. My daughter-in-law, Celeste Prescott, 34. A licensed real estate agent with a warm voice and a smile that always arrived right on time. In the footage, she pulled in at 10:15 at night. The next clip showed her leaving at 6 the following morning. 2 days later, she arrived at midnight, left at noon. The pattern wasn't caregiving. No caregiver visits at midnight on a Wednesday and leaves before sunrise. This was someone keeping watch. I kept scrolling. Day after day. Her SUV came and went at hours that made no sense for checking on blood pressure medication. 19 visits in 21 days. Not once during normal hours. Then, I found the clip that changed everything about Opal. Opal Redmond, 71. Our next-door neighbor, who has brought Lorraine lemon bars every Tuesday for 18 years. In the footage, time-stamped mid-afternoon during my second week away. Opal walked up the front path, carrying a foil-covered plate. She knocked. Celeste opened the door, stepped outside, and pulled it shut behind her. They talked for 30 seconds. Celeste's body language was a wall. Arms folded, weight forward, that calibrated smile. Opal nodded slowly and walked home with the plate still in her hands. If you've never sat in a dark garage watching someone you trusted dismantle your family one camera clip at a time, I hope you never do. The next morning's footage showed Celeste carrying a foil-covered plate out to her SUV. Opal must have left it at the door later. My wife never saw it. Lorraine's closest friend had been turned away, and the food she brought had been removed from the property. Nobody isolates a healthy person. You isolate someone you're trying to control. I scrolled faster. My thumb left sweat marks on the screen. The garage was silent. except for coyotes somewhere past the property line, and the soft click of each clip loading. The timestamp read 4:03 a.m., midweek, second week. The motion sensor triggered on a dark sedan pulling into the driveway with its headlights off. A woman stepped out, wearing light blue scrubs, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this kind of handoff before. I didn't know her name yet, but her face burned into my memory. Celeste was already waiting by the garage door. 40 seconds. That's all it took. The woman in scrubs handed Celeste a small silver pharmaceutical bag. Celeste handed back a paper sack. Even in grainy night footage, I could see the shapes inside pill bottles. My wife's pill bottles. 40 seconds. A bag in, a bag out. My wife's medication changed hands in my driveway at 4 in the morning like contraband. The woman got back in the sedan. Celeste watched it leave, then walked into the house through the garage door, silver bag in hand. Neither of them looked at the camera. I sat on that stool until the phone screen went dark. The concrete was cold through my boot soles. Stale coffee from hours ago sat bitter on my tongue. I thought about calling the police. I thought about waking Lorraine. I thought about driving to Celeste's house and putting my fist through her front door. I didn't do any of those things. I replayed the clip one more time, screenshotted every frame that showed a face, and saved them to a folder labeled with the date. Then I went inside, locked the garage behind me, and lay down next to my wife in the dark. She was breathing evenly for the first time all evening. I stared at the ceiling and made a decision. No confrontation, no warnings, no chance for anyone to destroy evidence or rehearse a story. 2 women had traded my wife's medication in a driveway at 4 in the morning, and a neighbor had been turned away from the front door so nobody outside the house could see what was happening inside. I was going to take this apart the way I take apart a downed power line, one connection at a time, in order, until I found where the current was coming from. The first connection was the pills, before the sun cleared the ridge east of Mesa, before Lorraine opened her eyes. I was already moving through the house with my phone camera and the discipline of a man who has inspected storm damage for 3.5 decades. One connection at a time. Start with what you can touch. I waited until the first line of light came through the bathroom window. Then I started counting pills the way I count cable connectors before a climb. Every single one accounted for. Every single one photographed. Medicine cabinet first. 3 bottles on the top shelf. 1 multivitamin. 1 calcium supplement. 1 blood pressure prescription, labeled with Lorraine's name and a doctor I didn't recognize. I photographed the front label, the back label, the lot number, the expiration date. Then I moved to the nightstand drawer. A bottle of aspirin, half empty. A sleeve of antacids, nothing unusual. The kitchen counter had a daily pill organizer, the kind with compartments for each day of the week, and every compartment from Monday through Sunday was filled with the same small tablets. Then I opened the blue binder. Lorraine kept a prescription binder, blue plastic cover, tabbed by year. Every prescription, every refill, every doctor's note since 2004. I used to tease her about it. Told her she was the only woman in Arizona who filed her pill receipts like tax returns. She'd say, "You never know when you'll need to prove what you took and when." I wasn't laughing now. That binder was about to become the most important document in our house. I turned each page the way I'd turn a wiring schematic, looking for the thing that didn't belong. 20 years of the same white oval tablet for blood pressure. Same manufacturer. Same imprint. Same shape. Refilled every 30 days at the same pharmacy on Southern Avenue. The record was clean, consistent, and unbroken until 6 weeks ago, when a new prescription appeared from a Dr. Farrell. a name I'd never seen in the binder before. In my line of work, you inspect every inch of cable before you send current through it. The one splice you skip is the one that kills someone. I was inspecting now, and the splice was wrong. I opened the
Lady
bottle
sings
from
a blues,
Dr.
thank you
Farrell's
for the
office
2 months
and poured the
subscription,
contents
thank you.
onto a white paper towel on the kitchen table. Most of the tablets were white ovals, consistent with what Lorraine had taken for years. But 3 of them were different. Smaller, round, pale yellow, a stamped imprint on one side I didn't recognize. Not from any blood pressure medication I'd ever seen in her binder. I lined them up next to the white ovals. The difference was obvious when you looked. But if you were swallowing them from a daily organizer without your reading glasses, trusting that whoever filled the compartments had given you the right pills, you'd never catch it. That was the point. You weren't supposed to catch it. I picked one up between my thumb and forefinger. Smooth, light, almost weightless. The kind of pill that dissolves fast and doesn't leave a taste. I set it back on the towel and took 6 photographs from different angles, making sure the imprint was legible in at least 2 of them. If you've ever thought your parents' medicine cabinet was someone else's responsibility, I need you to hear this. It took me 4 minutes to find what 3 weeks of daily visits had hidden in plain sight. I pulled a small Ziploc bag from the kitchen drawer, dropped the 3 yellow pills inside, and wrote the date on the plastic with a Sharpie. Then I walked to the garage. My red toolbox sat on the workbench where it sat since 1993. Combination lock. 4 digits I set the year I bought it. Lorraine doesn't know the code. Garrett doesn't know the code. And Celeste sure as hell doesn't know the code. I placed the bag inside, next to a voltage tester and a pair of insulated pliers, closed the lid, spun the dial, and walked back into the house. I returned the bottle to the medicine cabinet with the remaining pills undisturbed. Everything looked exactly the way it had before I started. Nobody would know I'd been through it. I stood at the kitchen sink and ran the water just to have something to listen to. 3 pills, pale yellow, wrong shape, wrong size, wrong imprint. I didn't know yet what they were, but I knew with absolute certainty what they weren't. They weren't blood pressure medication, and my wife had been swallowing them every morning, trusting the hands that put them in her organizer. For 21 days. It took one search, 6 characters typed into a pill identifier website while Lorraine slept and the house held its breath around me. The screen gave me a name I'd never heard for a drug my wife should never have been taking. Lorazepam, a benzodiazepine class sedative. I read the side effect list on the small screen and felt the kitchen shrink around me. Confusion, loss of balance, appetite suppression, significant weight loss with prolonged use, tremor, disorientation. I read it twice. And each time I saw my wife's face, the hollow cheeks, the hands that shook on the counter, the way she used the wall to walk 12 feet of hallway. Every symptom was on that list. Every single one. This wasn't a side effect of new blood pressure medication. This was the whole point. Someday had replaced Lorraine's pills with a sedative that would make her look confused, make her lose weight, make her forget things, and stumble and seem like a woman whose mind was leaving her. And they'd done it inside a bottle with a legitimate label, trusting that nobody would open it and look. I closed the browser and put the phone face down on the table. My mouth was dry. I hadn't eaten since I got home. None of that mattered. What mattered was getting Lorraine in front of a doctor who didn't have Celeste's phone number. I woke her gently and told her we were going to see someone about how she'd been feeling. She didn't argue. She didn't ask where. She just let me help her into the truck. One hand on the doorframe, the other gripping my arm, and we pulled out of the driveway into the late morning sun. I drove past the turnoff to Dr. Farrell's clinic on Camelback Road at 40 miles an hour and didn't touch the brake. That was the first decision I made that morning that felt like mine instead of Celeste's.
We passed Dr. Farrell's road.
Lorraine said quietly, looking at her hands in her lap. I know, I said. We're going somewhere else today. She didn't ask why. I think she already knew. She turned her face toward the window and watched the desert go by, and neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. Mesa General Hospital had no connection to Celeste, no connection to Dr. Farrell, and no reason to call anyone about our visit. I walked Lorraine through the emergency entrance and told the intake nurse my wife had been experiencing balance problems, weight loss, and confusion for 3 weeks. And I wanted a full workup. They took us back within the hour. Dr. Nora Greer was 48, an emergency physician with a direct manner and no patience for vague answers. She examined Lorraine with the unhurried thoroughness of a doctor who trusts her own instincts more than a referral file. She tested Lorraine's gait, had her walk heel to toe across the exam room. Lorraine wobbled after 4 steps. She checked reflexes. Slow. Pupil response. Sluggish. She weighed Lorraine and compared it to the number on her insurance file from a physical 8 months ago. 11 pounds lost. Dr. Greer checked Lorraine's reflexes the way I check a transformer testing for current where there shouldn't be any. And she found it. Mrs. Prescott, when did the balance issues start? She asked, pen moving across the chart. A couple of weeks after my husband left for his job, Lorraine said. They told me it was the new medication. Who told you that? Lorraine hesitated. My daughter-in-law. Dr. Greer made a note without changing expression. She ordered a full blood panel and a toxicology screen. Results in 2 to 3 days. A nurse drew blood from Lorraine's arm, the alcohol swab sharp and cold in the antiseptic air, and labeled the vials with a steadiness that felt almost ceremonial. Evidence in a tube. Lorraine went to use the restroom, and Dr. Greer turned to me. She set her pen down on the chart and looked at me with the expression of a woman who had just crossed from routine medicine into something else entirely. Her balance issues, the weight loss, the tremor, these aren't consistent with any blood pressure medication I'm aware of, she said. Has anything else changed recently? That's what I'm trying to find out. She lowered her voice. Mr. Prescott, is she taking anything else that you know of? I knew the answer. I had it locked in a red toolbox in my garage, with a combination nobody else in the family could open. 3 pale yellow tablets that didn't match anything in 20 years of prescriptions. I looked at this doctor I'd met 40 minutes ago and made a decision about trust that would shape everything that came after. I think someone else has been deciding what she takes, I said. Dr. Greer held my gaze for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen again and wrote something on the chart that I couldn't read from where I stood. When she looked up, her voice was careful and precise. And we need those results back as fast as possible. We drove home from Mesa General in silence. Dr. Greer had promised to rush the toxicology, but the results were still days away. That night, I helped Lorraine into bed and lay down beside her without turning on the light. The faint smell of hospital antiseptics still clung to her skin from the blood draw. Neither of us slept. I could tell by her breathing. It changed 3 times in the first 20 minutes, quickening like she was about to say something, then slowing back down as she swallowed it, starting and stopping, like a wire vibrating before the current hits. In 41 years of marriage, I've learned there are 2 kinds of silence between a husband and wife. One is peace. The other is a held breath. This was the second kind. So I lay still and let her find it. Lorraine doesn't respond to pushing. She never has. You wait. And eventually the door opens from the inside. The ceiling fan turned above us in the dark. Moonlight came through a crack in the curtains and put a thin silver line across the quilt. Her hands were folded on her chest. And even under the blanket, I could see how small she'd become. The woman lying next to me weighed at least 11 pounds less than the woman I'd kissed goodbye 3 weeks ago. And now I knew why. She spoke just after midnight. Her voice was barely louder than the fan. She came the first night. I didn't move. Didn't ask who. We both knew. She said the new doctor had changed my medication. That I had to take the pills exactly as she gave them to me. No questions. My wife has survived a hip replacement, a house fire in 2009, and raising a son through 2 broken arms and a motorcycle phase. She does not break easily. Someone broke her on purpose. When I asked why they looked different, her whole face changed. Lorraine's whisper thinned to almost nothing. She said if I didn't cooperate, she would tell the family I was losing my mind, that she'd have me evaluated, that she'd put me in a facility. I lay there in the dark, listening to my wife describe her own captivity, and the taste in my mouth was metallic and dry, like biting down on a wire. Celeste had come into my house on the first night I was gone, not the second week. Not after some gradual escalation. The first night. She'd arrived with pills and a script and a threat, fully prepared, as if she'd been waiting for me to leave. I tried to say no, Lorraine whispered. The first few days I tried. I hid the pills under my tongue once and spat them out after she left. But she came back the next morning and counted them. She knew one was missing. She counted the pills. My daughter-in-law counted sedatives the way a warden counts doses in a locked ward. I pressed my tongue against the roof of my mouth and said nothing. Because if I opened my mouth right then, what came out would not have been words. Lorraine's hand found mine under the quilt. Her fingers were ice cold despite the warm night. She gripped hard, and I felt the bones in her hand. Then she said the other thing. What kind of person looks at a grandmother's love for her grandchildren and sees a lever? She said if I didn't do what she asked, the pills, the papers, everything, I would never see those children again. Lorraine's voice cracked on the word children.
Hello.
Not at Christmas, not on their birthdays, never. She said she would make sure of it. That was the one. Not the threat of a facility, not the medication,
hello.
The grandchildren. Lily and Owen, 7 and 4. The ones Lorraine baked cookies with every other Saturday. The ones whose drawings covered the refrigerator door. Celeste had taken the thing my wife loved most in this world and turned it into a
Thank you for the
weapon.
20-watt streak.
And Lorraine had stopped fighting because the cost of fighting was losing them. I signed things. Virgil. She was crying now, silently, the way I'd found her the day before. Papers she brought at night. I don't even remember what they said. I just signed them because she said if I didn't, I'd never hold those kids again. I'm so sorry. I pulled her close. She was shaking. The quilt bunched between us, and I could feel her heart beating too fast against my chest. I didn't tell her it was okay. Because it wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. But I held on. And I let her cry. And I made a promise to myself in that dark room that I would find out exactly what those papers said. And whoever had designed this, the pills, the threats, the isolation, every piece of it was going to answer for it. Not tomorrow, not next week, on my schedule. In my way. After Lorraine fell asleep, I slipped out of bed and sat in the garage workshop in the dark, asking myself a question I should have asked 3 weeks ago. Why didn't I hear it in her voice? I pulled up my outgoing call log and scrolled back to the day I left for Las Cruces. 3 weeks. 21 days away from home. I found 5 calls to Lorraine's number. 5.
Digital dog.
I'd told myself that was reasonable. The cell
Hello,
coverage in the
everybody.
mountains was terrible. I was working 16-hour shifts on downed lines, and when I did have signal,
It was late, and I didn't want to wake her.
3 of those calls went unanswered. The other 2 connected. I remembered both. Lorraine picked up, sounding flat, distant, the kind of voice you use when someone is standing in the room. She said she was fine, just tired. Both conversations lasted under 90 seconds. I didn't push because I trusted that voice. I'd trusted it for 41 years. Now I sat in my garage at midnight, wondering if it was even her decision to answer. I thought about what Garrett had told me on the porch, that he called every day. Every single day. He'd said it with pride,
Harland,
like it was proof that his mother had been
Ego,
looked after.
Mark.
So I pulled up my text with him and cross-referenced the timestamps
Good
against
morning.
the camera footage still stored on my phone. Garrett called every day. That part was true. But he never called this house. Not once. Every call went to Celeste's phone. Every update about Lorraine came from Celeste's mouth. My son thought he was checking on his mother. He was checking on his wife's version of his mother. If you think 3 weeks without hearing your mother's real voice is impossible in a family that talks every day, you're right. It is impossible unless someone is standing between every call. Celeste didn't cut us off from Lorraine. That would have been obvious. That would have raised alarms. Instead, she positioned herself as the only bridge between Lorraine and everyone who loved her. And then she controlled what crossed it. Every reassurance Garrett repeated to me had originated with her. Every unanswered call to Lorraine's phone happened during hours when Celeste was in the house and could have handed Lorraine the phone, but didn't. The isolation wasn't a wall. It was a filter. And we'd all walked through it without noticing the glass. I set the phone down on the workbench and stared at the pegboard of tools hanging in the shadows. Pliers, wire strippers, voltage testers. Every tool organized by size, the way I've kept them for decades. Order, system, precision. That's how my mind works. And now I was applying it to the worst wiring diagram I'd ever seen. One where every connection ran through a single junction box named Celeste. Then I remembered something that made my stomach turn. 2 nights before I left for Las Cruces, we had dinner at Garrett and Celeste's house. Pot roast, sweet potatoes, the kids running between the table and the living room. Normal evening, normal family. Over dessert, Celeste asked me casually, coffee cup in hand, how the cell coverage was out in the mountains. Said she wanted to know in case she needed to reach me about Lorraine while I was gone. I told her the signal was spotty above 6,000 feet, that I'd be in a dead zone most mornings, and that the best time to reach me was between 7 and 9 at night when I was back at the base trailer.
Hey,
She
Frank.
nodded, smiled, and passed the salt. She asked me over pot roast how unreachable I'd be. And I answered her like she was asking out of kindness. I sat in that cold metal folding chair until the phone screen timed out and the garage went fully dark. My stomach was knotted too tight to eat. The smell of sawdust and motor oil. The smell of every good day I'd ever spent
Hey,
in this
Wolf
room
Claw.
now carried something else. The knowledge that I'd helped. I'd handed Celeste the schedule, the dead zones, and the window of time she needed to do everything she'd done. Not because I was careless, because I trusted her, because she was family. 5 calls from me. 0 that reached Lorraine without a filter. Every daily check from Garrett intercepted at the source. She hadn't just isolated my wife, she'd isolated all of us from each other, and done it so cleanly that none of us noticed until the damage was 3 weeks deep. And somewhere in this house, in a drawer or a folder, or wherever Lorraine had been made to put them, there were papers my wife had signed in the dark that I still hadn't found. 2 days I waited for that phone to ring. 2 days of cooking breakfast, answering Celeste's check-in calls with the voice of a man who didn't know anything, and watching my wife swallow a pill I was almost certain was poison. I let her take it. That's the part I'll carry for the rest of my life. I let her take it, because I'd read enough to know that stopping a sedative cold after weeks of daily use could trigger seizures, and because pulling the bottle would have told Celeste I knew. So I stood at the kitchen counter each morning and watched Lorraine shake a tablet out of that bottle and wash it down with water. And I said nothing. I cooked her eggs. I made sure she drank enough. I walked her to the garden and back, timing her balance, counting her steps, measuring the distance between who she was and who she was supposed to be. Celeste called twice during those 2 days. Both times I picked up and gave her what she expected, a tired husband, grateful for the help, not asking too many questions. It was the hardest performance I've ever given. I wanted to reach through the phone and ask her what kind of person drugs a 64-year-old woman and then calls to check on her like she's watering a plant. I didn't. I kept my voice even and hung up and went back to watching the clock. Have you ever watched someone you love take something you believe is hurting them and said nothing because saying something would put them in more danger than staying quiet? That's what those 2 days were. The phone rang on the morning of the 4th day. The caller ID said Mesa General. I stepped onto the back porch and answered before the second ring. Dr. Greer was direct. No preamble, no softening. I liked her for that. Mr. Prescott, the toxicology panel came back. There are elevated levels of a benzodiazepine sedative in your wife's blood that does not appear in any prescription on file with her insurance or with our system. I gripped the porch railing. What does the concentration tell you? It's not consistent with a one-time accidental ingestion, she said. There was a pause. I could hear her choosing her next words with the care of someone who understood exactly what they meant. The levels indicate sustained administration over a period of weeks. This is not an accident, Mr. Prescott. Someone has been giving this to her deliberately. I thanked her. I asked about next steps. She said she was required to document the findings in Lorraine's medical record and recommended I contact law enforcement. I told her I understood. I hung up. I've been hit by arc flash twice in my career. The blinding white burst when a high voltage line faults and the current jumps through the air. Both times. My body moved before my brain caught up. Muscles contracting, hands releasing, feet pushing backward off the pole. Reflex. Survival wiring that bypasses thought entirely. Standing on that porch with the phone still warm in my hand, my body did the same thing. My hands started shaking, not a tremor, shaking, against the railing, against my thighs, against anything I pressed them to. In 36 years of climbing ice-coated poles in wind that would peel paint off a truck, my hands have never shaken. They were shaking now, and I couldn't stop them. I set the phone on the porch railing and gripped the wood with both hands. The coffee I'd poured before the call sat on the kitchen counter inside, going cold. Through the glass door, I could see the breakfast dishes still on the table. 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 cups. The ordinary debris of a morning that had just stopped being ordinary. I stood there until the shaking stopped. It took longer than I wanted. The rage wasn't cold anymore. It was physical, electric. The kind that starts in your chest and pushes outward through your arms until your fingertips buzz. I breathed through it the way I breathe through altitude on a pole slow. Measured, deliberate, until my hands went still again. Then I picked up my keys from the hook by the door. Lorraine was asleep in the bedroom, breathing evenly, the quilt pulled up to her chin. I watched her for a moment from the hallway. She looked peaceful. She looked like a woman whose body was finally getting a few hours of rest between doses of something that had been dismantling her from the inside for 3 weeks. I walked past her, out through the garage, and got in my truck. Ramona Sinclair had been filling my wife's prescriptions at the pharmacy on 7th Avenue for 12 years. If anyone could tell me when the pills changed and who made the call that authorized it, she could. And unlike the doctor Celeste had chosen for Lorraine, Ramona owed nothing to anyone in my daughter-in-law's circle. Sinclair Family Pharmacy sits in a strip mall on 7th Avenue between a dry cleaner and a nail salon. I've been walking through its door for 12 years. Ramona Sinclair, 44, has filled every one of Lorraine's prescriptions in that time. The same counter, the same reading glasses pushed low on her nose, the same pen behind her ear. She looked up when I came in and knew from my face that I wasn't there for a refill. "I need everything you have on Lorraine's prescriptions from the last 4 weeks," I said. Every refill, every change, every call that came into this pharmacy about her medication. Ramona didn't ask why. She tilted her head toward the back counter and said, "Sit down back here. This won't take long." I remember most of it without looking. She pulled up the records on her computer first, then printed them 6 pages of prescription history going back 90 days. She laid them out chronologically on the counter between us, smoothing each page flat with the heel of her hand. I watched her finger move down the columns the way mine moves down a wiring schematic looking for the anomaly, the thing that shouldn't be there. She found it before I did. "Here," she said, tapping a line near the middle of the second page. October 2nd. A call came in requesting a switch from Lorraine's standard amlodipine to a new compound. A woman called and said she was staff from Dr. Farrell's office, authorizing the change on his behalf. October 2nd. I did the math without thinking. That was 4 days after I left for Las Cruces. In electrical work, you trace a fault by following the wire backward until you find the break. Ramona was helping me trace the wire, and the break was exactly where I expected it to be, timed to the day, coordinated with my departure like a switch being thrown the moment I was out of range. "Was she?" I asked. From his office, Ramona pulled up a separate log, the caller ID records the pharmacy's phone system stored automatically. She scrolled, stopped, and frowned. "The caller ID doesn't match his office number," she said. "It doesn't match any clinic I have on file." She turned the screen so I could see it. The number was there in plain text. 10 digits. No name attached. No practice. No location match. Someone had called this pharmacy, used Dr. Farrell's name and enough medical vocabulary to sound legitimate, and changed what my wife swallowed every morning. And they'd done it from a number that didn't belong to anyone in the system. 4 days. Celeste waited exactly 4 days after I drove away before someone called this pharmacy and changed what my wife was taking. Not Celeste herself. She was too careful for that. Someone else. Someone who could pass as medical staff on a phone call. Ramona was already moving. She printed the caller ID log, time-stamped it, and pulled a pharmacy evidence envelope from a drawer I'd never noticed behind the counter. She slid the prescription history and the caller record inside, signed across the seal with her pen, and wrote the date in block letters. "This is everything I can give you without a subpoena," she said. "The full dispensing record, the change authorization, and the caller ID log. If someone comes asking, I'll tell them I sealed it at your request, and I'll stand behind it." She set the envelope on the counter between us. It was thick with paper. 12 years of trust compressed into one sealed packet. "Ramona," I said, "that call, can you tell where it came from?" She shook her head slowly. "Not the exact location, but I can tell you it didn't originate from any number in the Phoenix metro area, whatever line that was. It's not local. Could be a cell, could be a burner, could be a private line registered somewhere else." She took off her reading glasses and looked at me straight. "Is Lorraine safe right now?" "She is," I said. "I'm making sure of that." "Good. She put the glasses back on and picked up her pen. Because whoever made that call knew exactly what they were doing. That wasn't a confused family member calling in a refill. That was someone who understood pharmacy protocol well enough to get past me. And I don't get fooled easily. I drove home with the sealed envelope on the passenger seat and the unknown caller ID written on a strip of receipt paper folded into my shirt pocket. An unfamiliar number, not the doctor's office, not Celeste's cell. Someone else had made that call. Someone with medical vocabulary and a reason to hide where they were calling from. I was building a list of people involved in what was happening to my wife, and it had just grown by one. The sealed envelope from Ramona sat on my workbench next to the toolbox. An unknown number. A fraudulent call. A third person I hadn't identified yet. But that could wait. Lorraine had told me she signed papers in the dark, and I needed to find them before anyone else knew I was looking. That evening, while Lorraine dozed in the bedroom, I went to the oak desk by the hallway window. She's kept that desk the same way since 1986. Tabbed dividers, color-coded folders, every document alphabetized and dated. Tax returns going back 20 years. Insurance policies, the deed to our property, our wills. She once told me that if the house caught fire, she'd grab the desk drawer before she grabbed her shoes. That's the kind of woman Lorraine is. Everything in its place. I opened the top drawer. Perfect order. The middle drawer, same. The bottom right drawer was different. The papers were stacked instead of tabbed. Edges uneven, as if someone had pulled things out and pushed them back in a hurry. Lorraine never hurries with paperwork. Not once in 41 years. I pulled the drawer all the way out and set it on the floor. Insurance documents on top, current, filed correctly. Beneath them, a property tax notice from last year. Beneath that, a thick envelope I'd never seen before. Heavy paper stock, legal size, no return address. I opened it and spread the contents on the hallway floor under the reading lamp. I've held a lot of dangerous things in my career. Live wire, cracked insulators, lines still humming with current that could stop a heart. None of them felt as dangerous as what I was holding now. Emergency petition for guardianship of an incapacitated adult. Filed in Maricopa County Superior Court. Petitioner Celeste Prescott. Subject Lorraine Prescott. Grounds cited in typed legal language: rapid cognitive decline, inability to manage personal and financial affairs, risk of self-harm through medication non-compliance. I read it twice. The language was precise, clinical, and written by someone who knew exactly what a court needed to hear. Rapid cognitive decline. That was the sedative. Inability to manage affairs. That was the confusion. The weight loss. The stumbling, all manufactured symptoms dressed up in legal vocabulary. Celeste hadn't just been drugging my wife. She'd been building a case. Every pill Lorraine swallowed was a piece of evidence for this petition, documented in symptoms that any judge would recognize as grounds for intervention. The petition requested full authority, not just medical decisions, but financial and property management. Every account, every asset, including the deed to 12 acres of land on the east side of Mesa that Lorraine and I have owned since 1991. I turned to the consent page. There was a signature at the bottom. It was supposed to be Lorraine's. The letters were the right shape, but the execution was wrong. Shaky, uneven. The pen wandering off the line in two places. I pulled an old tax return from the top drawer and laid the two signatures side by side under the lamp. Lorraine's real signature is clean, confident, slightly left-leaning. This one looked like it had been written by a hand that couldn't hold steady. Because it had. A handful of sedatives, signing in the dark, under threat of never seeing her grandchildren again. 10 days. What can you build in 10 days? A case, a defense, or if you're Celeste, a cage around a 64-year-old woman that the law itself would lock shut.
The hearing date was typed at the bottom of the last page in small font. I counted forward from today. 10 days.
If nobody contested this petition, a family court judge could grant Celeste temporary legal guardianship over Lorraine at a single hearing. Temporary in theory. In practice, once a guardian is appointed, reversing it takes months of legal proceedings and medical evaluations. By then, Celeste would have authority over every financial decision, the bank accounts, the retirement funds, and the land. I put every page back in the exact order I found it, slid the envelope beneath the insurance documents, and closed the drawer. I didn't take anything. I didn't photograph anything yet. I needed the papers to stay exactly where they were, so Celeste wouldn't know I'd seen them. I sat on the hallway floor with my back against the wall and stared at the closed desk. The clock on the wall ticked. Lorraine's breathing was faint and steady from the bedroom. The bile at the back of my throat tasted like copper. 10 days. Celeste had filed for emergency guardianship while I was climbing poles in New Mexico. And if I hadn't come home when I did, not a single person would have contested it. But I was home now. And before I could fight this petition, I needed to answer the one question that would make everything else make sense. Why did a real estate broker with a good income need legal control of her mother-in-law's 12 acres badly enough to poison her for it? I kept asking myself the same question on the drive downtown. What is 12 acres of scrub desert worth to a woman willing to poison her own mother-in-law for it? By the time I parked at the Maricopa County zoning office, I'd stopped guessing and decided to let the public record answer. The building smelled like every government office I've ever been in, recycled air, old paper, and toner. I walked up to the public records counter and told the clerk I needed anything pending on our parcel address. Federal, state, county, any level. She typed the address into her system, waited, and then tilted her screen slightly like she was deciding how much to show me. There's a file flagged on this parcel, she said. Draft status. Pending public comment. You're welcome to review it at the counter. She printed it and set it in front of me. Federal letterhead. Department of Transportation. A corridor feasibility study for a proposed highway expansion through the eastern edge of Mesa. Dated 3 months ago. I don't know zoning law. I know wire gauges and transformer ratings, but I can read a government map. And the red line on this one ran straight through the center of our property like someone had drawn it with a ruler and a grudge. 12 acres of desert we'd owned since 1991 paid off in full 22 years ago, sitting directly in the path of a major federal construction project. The study included an appraisal summary. Affected properties along the corridor were estimated at 5 to 6 times their current assessed values, based on projected commercial development around the new interchange points. I traced my finger down the column until I found our parcel. $900,000. That's what our land was worth to Celeste. Not as a home, not as the place where Lorraine planted her garden and I built the workbench in the garage. As a line item in a federal corridor study that hadn't been made public yet. I did the math. Current county assessment $180,000. Projected value after the expansion announcement over $900,000. A 5-fold increase. The kind of number that makes a real estate broker's eyes go wide, especially a broker who sees the study before anyone else. I stood at that counter and felt every piece of the last 5 days lock into place with the precision of a breaker panel snapping shut. The pills, the forged signature, the guardianship petition requesting financial and property authority, the isolation, the scripted phone calls, the woman in scrubs at 4 in the morning, all of it. Every single piece pointed at this map. Celeste is a licensed real estate broker. She works with developers, zoning boards, county planners. Draft corridor studies like this one circulate through industry channels months before public comment periods open. She didn't stumble onto this information. She had it before anyone in our family, before the neighbors, before the town council even scheduled a hearing. She saw the number. She saw the opportunity. And she built a machine to capture it. If someone in your family works in real estate and suddenly starts volunteering to manage your elderly parents' affairs, ask yourself what they know that you don't. Ask what changed. Ask why now. The machine was simple once you saw the blueprint. Poison the wife with sedatives that mimic cognitive decline. Document the symptoms over 3 weeks while the husband is unreachable. In a cell dead zone, she'd mapped herself over pot roast. File an emergency guardianship petition using the manufactured decline as evidence. Win the hearing unopposed. Gain legal authority over all financial and property decisions. Sell 12 acres to a developer at 5 times value before the public announcement makes the price common knowledge. Walk away with $900,000 of someone else's life. And the cost of the entire operation was an old woman's medication. And 3 weeks of silence. I asked the clerk for copies. She printed them without comment. I folded the corridor map and the appraisal summary into my jacket pocket and walked out into the Phoenix sun. The heat hit me like a wall. But for the first time in 5 days, the fog in my head was gone. I had the motive. I had the mechanism. I had the timeline. What I didn't have was enough time. 9 days until the hearing. 9 days to take everything I'd gathered. The camera footage, the toxicology, the pharmacy records, the guardianship papers, and now the highway map, and put it in front of someone who could turn it into a legal weapon before a judge I'd never met decided my wife's future in a courtroom I'd never been inside. I needed a lawyer. Not next week. Today. Before I tell you what the lawyer said, let me know in the comments if you found out someone in your family had been drugging your spouse. Would you go to the police first? Or gather your own evidence first? I read every comment. Now, back to the story. Boyd Ashford's secretary heard something in my voice on the phone and got me in within the hour. I drove straight from the zoning office to Scottsdale and walked into his office carrying a folder that weighed less than a pound and held enough evidence to end a marriage, a career, and a woman's freedom. Boyd Ashford was 63 years old, an elder law attorney who'd been practicing in the Valley for over 3 decades. He sat behind a mahogany desk with law books lining the wall behind him and afternoon light cutting through plantation blinds. He didn't shake my hand with sympathy or ask how I was holding up. He pointed to the leather chair across from him and said, "Show me what you have." I laid each piece on his desk the way you'd lay tools before a job in order. Each one where it needed to be. First, the phone, cued to the camera footage from 4 in the morning. A woman in scrubs entering through the side gate, moving through my house like she had a key. Boyd watched the full clip without expression. Then the sealed pharmacy records from Ramona showing the prescription change authorized by a phone number that didn't match any physician on file. The toxicology panel from the hospital confirming sustained sedative levels consistent with weeks of administration. The guardianship petition with my wife's signature on the consent line, a signature I knew she didn't write because she'd told me herself she never signed anything willingly. And last, the highway corridor map I'd pulled from the zoning office that morning, with the red line running through our property. "This is what I found in 5 days," I said. "There may be more I haven't found yet." Boyd's secretary brought water. I drank it without tasting it. I've known Boyd Ashford for 15 years, since he handled the estate paperwork when my mother passed. I've watched him listen to bad news the same way, every time reading glasses folded precisely on the desk. Eyes half closed, like a man reading something written on the inside of his eyelids. When he opens them, he's already 3 steps ahead of you. He opened his eyes. "Mr. Prescott, I want to be very clear about what you've brought me." His voice was measured, the kind of calm that comes from decades of delivering verdicts to people who aren't ready to hear them. "This is not a family disagreement. This is not a misunderstanding about medication management." He picked up the toxicology report and set it beside the guardianship petition. "What you have described and what these documents support is deliberate poisoning of a vulnerable adult. That alone is a Class 2 felony in Arizona. Combined with the fraudulent guardianship filing using a forged signature, you add a count of forgery and a count of fraud upon the court. The highway corridor map and her professional access to draft zoning studies introduce conspiracy to seize property through privileged commercial information." He folded his glasses again and placed them on the desk with the precision of a man who measures every gesture. "Any single one of these carries prison time. Together, they constitute a pattern that any prosecutor in Maricopa County would present to a grand jury within a week of receiving the file." The word prosecutor landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Until that moment, some part of me had still been holding on to the idea that this could be explained. That there was a version of events where Celeste had made a mistake, gotten bad advice, panicked. Boyd had just closed that door with the quiet authority of a man who'd seen 100 of these cases and knew exactly what this one was. He leaned forward in his chair. "Now I need to know one thing from you. We can handle this within the family. I file an emergency motion to dismiss the guardianship. We get a protective order. We remove her access to your wife and your property, and this stays private. Your grandchildren don't see their mother in handcuffs." He paused. "Or you can pursue every legal consequence available: criminal referral, prosecution, sentencing. The guardianship gets dismissed either way. But the second path means your daughter-in-law faces a courtroom, a jury,
Ultra comfy, Mark. Hello.
and a judge. 7 and 4. Those are the ages of the 2 people who would lose their mother if I said yes. And those are the ages of the 2 people whose names Celeste had used as a threat to keep their grandmother swallowing pills every morning for 3 weeks. I sat in that leather chair and thought about mercy. I thought about Christmas mornings and birthday candles and cookie flour on a Saturday afternoon. I thought about what it would cost those children. Then I thought about Lorraine gripping the kitchen counter because her legs wouldn't hold her. I thought about the pills she took every morning because she believed she'd never see those grandchildren again if she stopped. I looked Boyd in the eye. "Every consequence the law allows." Boyd didn't flinch when I said it. He just pulled a yellow legal pad from his drawer and started writing. "Because men like Boyd Ashford don't waste time on reactions when there's a clock running." He drew a vertical line down the center of the page and wrote 2 words at the top of each column: court and criminal. 2 tracks, he said, tapping the pad with his pen. Track 1 is the guardianship. I file an emergency motion to dismiss on day 8 late enough that she can't regroup, early enough that the judge has time to review the evidence before the hearing date. The forged signature alone should be sufficient,
Jackie.
but the toxicology makes it bulletproof. He moved his pen to the second column. Track 2 runs simultaneously. I send a complete referral package to Adult Protective Services and the Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office. Camera footage, pharmacy records, toxicology panel. The highway corridor study showing motive. APS opens an investigation. The prosecutor evaluates for criminal charges. By the time she walks into that courtroom, expecting to win guardianship, there will be an investigator and a prosecutor who already know her name. And between now and then, I asked. "Nothing changes," Boyd said.
DJX.
He set his pen down
Hello.
and looked at me the way he had when he'd told me my mother's estate was more complicated than I thought 15 years ago. Direct, no softening. The rule from this moment forward: you do not confront her. You do not call her. You do not change a single visible thing about your routine. If she calls, you answer. If she visits, you let her in. She has to believe she's still winning. In storm restoration, you don't energize a down line until every connection point is secured and tested. One premature switch, and the whole system shorts out. Boyd was securing connections. The current would come on day 10. I drove home with the legal pad's 2 columns burned into my memory. Lorraine was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. The pill bottle pushed to the far edge like something she couldn't bring herself to touch, but couldn't throw away either. She looked up, and I saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. What did the lawyer say? I sat down across from her and told her everything. The felony charges Boyd had identified, the 2-track strategy, the 9-day timeline. And then I told her the part that mattered most. No more pills, I said. Not a single one, starting right now. If the withdrawal gets rough, the hospital knows what you were given and they'll manage it. But you are done swallowing whatever she put in those bottles. Lorraine's hand moved to the table's edge, close to the bottle, but not touching it. And if she comes by, she asked. If she calls, you smile. You tell her you're feeling a little better today. You let her think everything is exactly the way she left it. Something changed in Lorraine's face. Not relief, not yet. Something harder than that. She looked at the pill bottle and then back at me. You're asking me to pretend she hasn't done this to me. I'm asking you to pretend for 9 days. Then she will never set foot in this house again. I had rebuilt transmission towers after ice storms. I had rewired substations in 112-degree heat and restored power to towns that had been dark for a week. But sitting at my own kitchen table, telling my wife she was safe, that was the hardest piece of work I had ever done. Because I could see in her eyes that she wanted to believe me, and wasn't sure she could. She nodded. I cooked dinner, roasted chicken, nothing complicated. The first full meal she'd eaten in days. She ate most of it. We didn't talk about Celeste, or pills, or courtrooms. We talked about the garden, about whether the rosemary had survived the heat while I was gone. Small things, real things. That night, for the first time in 3 weeks, Lorraine fell asleep before I did. No tossing, no whimpering into the pillow, no waking at 2 in the morning to check the locks on the doors. Her hand rested open on the pillow instead of clenched, and her breathing was deep and even. The sound of a woman who knows someone is standing guard. The pills hadn't broken her. The loneliness had. 3 weeks of swallowing whatever was handed to her because she believed that refusing meant losing her grandchildren, and carrying that weight in total silence because there was no one to tell.
Who is it?
That was over now.
I
lay beside her, listening to her breathe, and counted the days. 9 left.
I don't know them.
Boyd had his legal pad. Ramona had her sealed records. The hospital had the toxicology. And somewhere across town, Celeste was checking her phone, wondering why nobody had panicked yet, not realizing that the silence she was hearing wasn't compliance. It was the sound of a trap being built around her, one document at a time. 2 days passed. Lorraine kept her end of the bargain. She smiled when Celeste called, said she was feeling a little better, and hung up. The trap held. On day 7, I walked into a government building I had never been inside before to say words I had never said out loud to a stranger. My daughter-in-law is poisoning my wife. The Maricopa County Adult Protective Services office smelled like every government building recycled air, communal coffee, and copy paper.
I don't think I know a single
A receptionist
Belgian streamer
directed
come to
me
think
to
of
a
it.
second-floor
Actually, that's
office
not
at the
why
end of a
I was
corridor
thinking.
lit by fluorescent panels that buzzed
Yeah,
just
apart from
loud
him, I don't
enough
know
to
any Belgian
notice.
streamers.
The name on the door read Adrian Caldwell. She was 41. An APS investigator who had been with the county for over a decade. She had the unreadable patience of someone who listens to terrible things for a living. No visible reaction. No sympathy face. Just a legal pad and a pen, and eyes that tracked every word like a court reporter. I would learn later that she had once given a talk on elder exploitation at Lorraine's church group. That morning, she was simply the woman across the desk who would decide whether I was credible. Walk me through everything from the beginning, she said. Don't leave anything out.
Change the volume.
I had rehearsed this on the drive over, organizing it the same way I had for Boyd.
I just didn't like it. It sounded
But
weird.
there
It
was
sounds
a difference I
artificial.
hadn't
Where it, like,
anticipated.
makes some bits louder and
With
some bits
Boyd,
quieter artificially.
I had spoken in legal terms, evidence, felony
Don't
counts,
like it.
strategy.
So I'm gonna stick to this mode.
With
instead.
Caldwell, I had to speak in human ones. I had to sit across from a county investigator and say that my son's wife had been substituting my wife's medication with sedatives, that she had manufactured symptoms of cognitive decline, that she had
Although
filed a
these
guardianship
microphones
petition
are
with a
quite different from
forged
the
signature,
the second
that
generation.
she had done
mics.
all of it to seize property she
different-
knew was about to multiply
They
in
definitely
value.
have a different sound.
There is a difference between
you know?
knowing
Can't really
something
put my
terrible
finger on
and
exactly
reporting
what,
it.
but-
Knowing lets you carry it privately. Turn it over in your hands. Keep it
They sound
contained.
different.
Reporting means you have handed it to the system and trusted a stranger to believe you. Sitting in that hard plastic chair with my mouth dry and my folder open on her desk, I understood why so many people
Like,
never
volume
make
sounds good
that
now,
call.
okay.
Caldwell
Yeah, I
didn't
mean, it's-
interrupt.
I just put it on what
She
it was.
wrote in a precise shorthand
The
that filled the
auto
page
setting. I
in
don't
tight
wanna have it
rows,
dynamic where it's
turning to a
artificially
fresh
kind of
sheet every few minutes
making
without looking up.
Some things
When
louder,
I
some
finished
things
the
quieter,
narrative, I opened the folder and set each piece in front of her the way I had for Boyd, in order, each where it needed to be. She reviewed the toxicology panel first, then the pharmacy records with Ramona's seal. She read the guardianship petition twice, running her finger along the signature line. She studied the corridor map
Was
without
it the
comment.
DJI? No.
Then
But I know that the
she
DJI
picked up my phone.
microphones
Play the
do
footage,
that as well, or that at least they
she
have a
said.
setting to do that. So
I cued it to the clip. The timestamp read 4:03
I tried those DJI
a.m.
mics and
The
they
woman
weren't
in
for me.
scrubs came through the side gate,
So
crossed the yard, and entered through the kitchen
here's what
door.
it is.
Caldwell watched it in silence. When it ended, she set the phone down. Play it again. I played it again. This time she leaned closer, her pen motionless on the pad. Once more. 3 times. Nobody watches anything 3 times unless they are matching it against something they have already seen. The first viewing was assessment. The second was comparison. The third time, her pen had stopped moving entirely, and she was staring at the frozen frame with an expression I hadn't seen on her face during the rest of the meeting. Recognition. She set the phone down carefully and turned to her desktop monitor, angling the screen slightly away from
Hey
me.
Frank, good morning.
I heard keystrokes slow, deliberate. The kind of typing that comes from entering a name or a case number rather than composing a sentence, I said. Identical, Caldwell said. Sedative substitution to manufacture symptoms of cognitive decline. Emergency guardianship petition based on those symptoms. Property seizure as the endgame. The only difference is scale. The Saguaro Ridge property was worth roughly $120,000. Your property, with the highway corridor factored in, is worth considerably more. And what happened to Ballard? License revoked. The Board of Nursing acted quickly. But the criminal charges were dropped when the family declined to press them. The nephew cooperated just enough to avoid prosecution himself. Ballard walked. If someone hurts your family and walks free, you tell yourself it is over. You tell yourself the system handled it and you can move forward. But it is never over. It just moves to the next family and the next until someone decides it stops. Caldwell closed the Saguaro Ridge file and placed her hands flat on the desk. I spoke with Dorothy's daughter this morning. Her name is well. I'll let her introduce herself when the time comes. She has been waiting 2 years for someone to reopen this. She said she will testify. Provide records, medical documentation, anything the prosecutor needs. Caldwell paused. Her exact words were, "Don't let them get away with it this time." A woman I had never met, in a county I had never visited, holding the same anger I was holding, because the same two people had done this to her mother first. Dorothy was still alive, Caldwell told me, but she had never fully recovered her independence. She lived with her daughter now.
She could not manage her own medications because the months of sedative substitution had done real neurological damage that no court ruling could reverse.
I looked at the 2 photos still on Caldwell's monitor. Jolene Ballard's licensing portrait, and the frozen figure crossing my yard in the dark. The same woman, the same method, the same indifference to the person swallowing the pills. 2 years ago, she had walked free. She was not going to walk free again. But before the warrants could move, there was one more person in Celeste's circle who needed to answer for what he had allowed to happen under his name. The person who still needed to answer was the doctor, not the hospital physician who had helped me, but the one Celeste had put Lorraine in front of the one whose name appeared on a prescription that someone had changed without his knowledge. Or so he would claim. I wasn't there for what happened next. Boyd handled it alone. And Boyd doesn't embellish. He told me everything that evening, over the phone. And I am telling it the way he told me. Boyd walked into the clinic at 9 in the morning without an appointment. The practice belonged to Dr. Olden Farrell, 52, a family physician who had opened his own office barely a year earlier in a strip mall suite on Camelback Road. The kind of place with a faded sign that read, "Family Medicine and a waiting room with 6 chairs, 4 of them empty." Celeste had recommended Farrell to Lorraine just before I left for Las Cruces. At the time it seemed helpful. Now it seemed designed. The receptionist looked up when Boyd set his business card on the counter. It read, "Elder Law." She hesitated for exactly the amount of time it takes to calculate whether the man standing in front of you is the kind of problem that gets worse if you make him wait. 5 minutes, Boyd said. It's in his interest to see me now rather than later. She let him through. Before I tell you what Dr. Farrell admitted behind that office door, drop your guess in 1 sentence. What do you think his role really was? Because this next part changes who was guilty and who was just careless. Please note what follows contains some recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. How much does it cost to buy a door into someone's medical life? In Dr. Farrell's case, $500. Celeste had offered him a referral fee, cash. No paperwork for taking Lorraine on as a new patient. Farrell needed the business. His practice was barely covering rent. He took the money, wrote a legitimate prescription for amlodipine, standard blood pressure medication, and didn't ask why a real estate broker was steering elderly patients to a strip mall clinic, 15 miles from their home. She offered me the referral to help her mother-in-law. Farrell told Boyd. His voice cracked on the word help. I wrote a legitimate prescription, standard dose. I had no idea anyone altered it after it left my office. Boyd set the pharmacy records on the desk, the ones Ramona had sealed. Then explained why the pharmacy received a call from an unregistered number authorizing a medication change under your name and DEA number. That call did not come from this office. Can you prove that? Farrell gripped the edge of his desk. Boyd told me the man's knuckles went white. The antiseptic smell of the exam rooms leaked through the hallway door, mixing with the stale coffee on Farrell's desk. And the only sound was the quiet hum of a half-empty clinic where a doctor was watching his career balance on a single answer. I have phone records, Farrell said. Every call in and out of this office is logged through the answering service. I can show you that number never connected to my line. Boyd believed him. Not because Farrell was convincing,
but because the phone records would either confirm or destroy him. And a guilty man doesn't volunteer evidence that can be checked.
I don't hate Dr. Farrell. I have thought about it carefully, and I don't. He was a man who needed patience badly enough to take cash from a stranger and not ask the right questions. But not asking the right questions when someone's life is in your hands, that is a kind of failure I cannot bring myself to forgive either. Boyd offered him a choice. Sign a sworn statement detailing the referral fee, the legitimate prescription, and his denial of the pharmacy call. Cooperate as a witness. In return, Boyd would advocate that the medical board treat the referral fee as an ethical violation rather than criminal conduct. Farrell signed. Boyd told me his hand was shaking so hard the signature barely looked like his own. Before Boyd reached the door, Farrell asked one question.
Hello,
Will I lose my license?
Good morning.
That depends on whether what you just signed is the whole truth, Boyd said.
Good morning.
If it is, you'll probably keep it. If it isn't, I can't help you. Boyd walked out with a sworn statement, a cooperating witness, and one more piece of the wall closing around Celeste. The referral, the pharmacy fraud, the sedatives, the forged petition, the highway scheme, the prior case, and now a doctor who would testify that Celeste had paid to put my wife in his chair. But there was still one person who didn't know any of this.
Thank you.
And that evening, he showed up at my door.
Yes, please.
The front door opened at 7:14 that evening. Garrett stood there, with his keys still in his hand, and a look on his face I hadn't seen since he was a boy, waking up from a nightmare he couldn't name. Pure, wordless
Can I get
fear.
the receipt as well?
Boyd's call about Farrell had come an hour earlier, but I hadn't had time to process it before my son was standing in the hallway.
She called me 4 times today, Garrett said before I could speak. 4. The last one she was crying and telling me everything was fine. Nobody cries when everything is fine. Dad. He was still wearing his work clothes, steel-toed boots, a sun-faded shirt with pipeline dust on the shoulders. He had driven straight from the job site in Tempe without stopping. Celeste's calls over the past 2 days had shifted from the calm reassurances he was used to hearing into something else. Urgent requests not to visit, insistence that Lorraine was fine, that the doctor had everything handled, that there was no reason for him to come home early. The more she told him to stay away, the faster he drove. I led him into the study and closed the door.
Sit down, son. I need to show you something. And you need to see all of it before you say a word.
He sat. I opened the manila folder on the desk and began. There is no manual for showing your son that his wife tried to kill his mother.
Extra fried bread. Oh well.
You cannot soften it. You cannot ease into it with context or qualifications. You lay each piece on the desk and watch the person you raised try to hold together while his world comes apart one document at a time. I started with the camera footage. Garrett watched the woman cross the yard in the dark and enter through the kitchen door. He didn't recognize her. I told him we now knew her name and her history. Then the toxicology panel. I let him read the numbers himself. The sustained sedative levels that no legitimate prescription could explain. The pharmacy records, with Ramona's seal, showing the medication change authorized by a number that didn't match any physician on file. Garrett's face lost color under the desk lamp. Not all at once. Gradually. The way a bulb dims when the voltage drops. I showed him the guardianship petition next. He stared at the signature line for a long time. That's her handwriting on the petition, he said quietly.
I was gonna say
But
that,
that's
but
not Mom's signature.
I come here too often.
I've seen Mom sign 1,000 things. That is not hers. Your mother says the same thing. She doesn't remember signing it. Then the corridor map. The federal study. the property values, the timeline that made every other piece click into place, the reason a real estate broker with zoning contacts would need legal control of an elderly woman's property before a public announcement made the opportunity common knowledge. Garrett stood up without a word and walked to the bathroom. I heard him through the door. When you raise a child, you learn every sound they make. Laughter, frustration, pain. This was a sound I had never heard from him before. The sound of a man whose body was rejecting what his mind had just been forced to accept. How do you forgive yourself for trusting the person you married? I watched my son try to answer that question when he came back and lowered himself into the chair like a man twice his age. His hands were shaking, his eyes were red, and the guilt hit him before the anger did. She told me Mom was adjusting to new medication, he said. She said the doctor recommended the change. I was 200 miles away on a pipeline job, and I believed her. I believed every word because she's my wife and I didn't have a reason not to. He pressed his palms against his eyes. I talk to her every day. Every single day, Dad. She'd call me after she checked on Mom and tell me everything was fine. And the whole time she was the one doing this. His voice broke on the last word. Not loudly. Garrett has never been loud. It broke the way a wire breaks under sustained tension. Quietly, completely, at the point you couldn't see. I didn't see any of it. I let the silence hold. There was nothing I could say that would make those words hurt less. His daily phone calls hadn't been a son checking on his family. They had been Celeste's cover, proof that the family was informed and satisfied. A shield she could point to if anyone asked questions. Garrett sat in that chair for a long time after the last document. Then he looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and said something I did not expect. What do you need me to do? Not anger, not denial. Just a man who had made up his mind before his hands stopped shaking. The first thing my son asked after he decided to fight was the question I had been dreading most. Not about warrants or hearings. He looked at me and said, "What do I tell the kids?" Lily was 7. Owen was 4. They hadn't seen their grandmother in weeks because Celeste kept finding reasons to cancel soccer practice. A cold, a birthday party. Every cancellation had sounded reasonable. Now, everyone looked like what it was. A wall, built between 2 children and the grandmother, someone was trying to erase. Tell them Grandma got sick and she's getting better, I said. Tell them next weekend they'll come over and make cookies with her. And that part will be true. Garrett nodded. Then I told him the rest. One more day. That's all Boyd needs. You go home tonight. You kiss her goodnight. And you act like this conversation never happened. You give us 24 more hours. You're asking me to sleep next to the woman who poisoned my mother. I'm asking you to protect your mother by giving us one more day of silence. His jaw tightened. I saw the war behind his eyes. Every instinct wanted to drive home and put his fist through the kitchen wall. But Garrett is a pipeline welder. He works with pressurized systems. He knows what happens when you release pressure at the wrong joint. He nodded. Watching your son read his own wife's lies is like watching someone pull stitches from a wound they didn't know they had. Every thread hurts worse than the last because they trusted the hand that sewed it shut. We moved to the kitchen. Garrett sat with his phone and my laptop, screenshotting every text Celeste had sent him over the past 3 weeks and forwarding each one to an email address Boyd had set up for evidence collection. The messages scrolled past in blue and gray bubbles. October 6th, he said, voice flat. She texted me that Mom loved the new doctor, that Mom was sleeping better. She put a smiley face at the end. Save all of it. Every message is a timestamp on a lie. A pattern emerged that neither of us had seen until the messages were laid out in sequence. On the exact days the camera had captured the woman in scrubs entering our house. Celeste had sent Garrett an unusual flood of texts, 4, 5, 6, in a single afternoon. Cheerful updates about Lorraine's appetite, about walks they supposedly took together. A wave of normalcy timed to bury each nighttime visit under daytime reassurance. She hadn't just lied to Garrett, she had calibrated the lies to the schedule. Every visit by Jolene Ballard had a corresponding surge of happy messages, designed to keep my son calm and far away. Garrett set the phone down and pressed both palms flat on the table. The coffee we had poured hours ago sat cold and untouched. The only light came from the phone screen and the lamp over the stove. And in that dim glow, my 37-year-old son looked like the boy who used to sit in that same chair doing homework while Lorraine cooked dinner behind him. If you have ever had to send your child into a situation you knew would break them, and stood at the door knowing you could not go with them, then you know what that kitchen felt like near midnight. One more thing, Garrett said. He wasn't looking at me. She told me yesterday she's planning a surprise visit to Mom this weekend. Want to bring the kids over Saturday afternoon. Saturday, day 10. The same day Boyd expected the warrants to move. She'll be here, I said. She'll be here, Garrett confirmed. He stood and walked to the hallway. Lorraine's lavender hand cream sat on the coat rack shelf where she always kept it. Garrett picked it up, held it for a moment, and set it back down without a word. Then he turned and put his arms around me. He held on the way he used to when he was 7 and the thunder was too loud. I held him back. There was nothing left to say that the documents hadn't already said for us. He let go, opened the front door, and walked to his truck. I stood in the doorway and watched his taillights turn the corner at the end of our street. My son was driving home to lie beside the woman who had tried to destroy his mother. He had to walk through that door and smile. He had to hold it for 24 more hours. 2 days. Every piece was in position. Now we just had to hold the silence long enough for the law to move. Boyd answered on the first ring, which meant he had been waiting. Boyd Ashford does not wait unless something is about to move. Celeste's planned Saturday visit was no longer a concern by the time she arrived at our door. The world she had built would already be collapsing behind her. "The motion's filed," Boyd said. "Even if the judge takes the full 48 hours, Celeste's petition is frozen as of 9 this morning. She cannot move on the guardianship. The forged signature alone would have been enough. But I attached the toxicology, the pharmacy records, and Farrell's sworn statement. This petition is dead. And the criminal side. Caldwell has her warrants. She's ready to move tomorrow morning. Both targets, same time, different locations." I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long moment. 9 days. It had taken 9 days to build a case that should have taken months. But when someone is poisoning your wife, you don't have months. You have whatever time you can carve out between the last pill she swallowed and the next one someone tries to put in her hand. Caldwell called at noon. Her voice carried the flat, practiced cadence of someone who has delivered operational briefings before and knows that clarity matters more than comfort. "Arrest warrants for Celeste Prescott and Jolene Ballard," she said. "Search warrants for Celeste's home office and Ballard's residence." We served Ballard at 6 a.m. at her apartment. Celeste at her real estate office by 9. 2 teams, simultaneous. If we take Ballard first and Celeste hears about it, she runs, or she destroys records. So we hit both before either one can make a phone call. "What do you need from me?" "Your son and those children nowhere near either address, Ballard's place or Celeste's office." "Garrett knows. He'll have the children at my house by 7. "Good," she paused. "After tomorrow, you won't need to keep any more secrets. Mr. Prescott, I set the phone down and looked at the calendar on the refrigerator. Tomorrow was circled in Lorraine's handwriting from weeks ago. A dentist appointment she had forgotten to cancel. The small details of a life that had been stolen from her, one pill at a time. Tomorrow that calendar would mean something different. That evening I made soup. Lorraine's recipe. The one she taught me 20 years ago when I insisted I should know how to cook at least one thing properly. Chicken, vegetables, a bay leaf she always said I added too early. I made it exactly the way she showed me and set 2 bowls on the kitchen table. She ate the whole bowl. The first full meal she had finished in weeks. Afterward, we sat on the back porch. The desert air carried dust and sage and something else. Something floral that I hadn't noticed in days. I walked out here by myself today, Lorraine said. I haven't done that in 3 weeks. I noticed. Watching Lorraine walk without the railing was like watching someone return from a country I had been afraid she would never leave. 3 steps from the door to her chair, and every one of them was an answer to a question I had been too scared to ask out loud. 2 days off those pills and her hands were steady. Her eyes tracked clearly. Her voice didn't trail off mid-sentence the way it had when I first came home. The sedatives hadn't mimicked decline. They had manufactured it. And now that they were gone, her body was telling the truth that Celeste had tried to bury. There was nothing wrong with Lorraine Prescott that a criminal hadn't put there. She picked up her tea and held it without a rattle. 2 weeks ago, that cup had shaken in her grip like a leaf in a crosswind. Now it was still. Whatever you're doing, Virgil, she said quietly, don't stop. She leaned her head against my shoulder. The jasmine along the back fence had started blooming while I was in Las Cruces, and she told me she could smell it again. She hadn't been able to smell anything for 2 weeks. The sedatives had dulled even that. I put my arm around her and watched the last light fade over the yard. The garden was half dead from 3 weeks of neglect, but the jasmine had survived on its own. Some things hold on, whether anyone tends to them or not. Tomorrow morning at 6, Caldwell would knock on Jolene Ballard's door. By 9, it would be Celeste's turn, and by noon, every secret I had carried for 9 days would belong to the court tonight. I sat with my wife on the porch and listened to her breathe and let the jasmine do what jasmine does. Bloom in the dark, whether anyone is watching or not. Caldwell's text came at 5:47 a.m. 2 words on the screen. Moving now. I stood in the kitchen, holding the phone with both hands, while the coffee I had poured 10 minutes ago sat on the counter going cold. Outside. The sky over Mesa was still the deep blue of the hour before sunrise, and the street was silent. Somewhere in Tempe, a team of deputies was walking up to a duplex door. The second text arrived 13 minutes later. Ballard in custody. No resistance. I set the phone down and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 9 days. Caldwell called at 7 to fill in the details. I listened from the kitchen table while Lorraine slept in the next room, steady and dreamless. Jolene Ballard had answered the door in a bathrobe. She saw the badges, looked past the deputies to the county vehicle in the driveway, and stepped aside without a word. No protest, no surprise. She moved like a woman who had been counting down to this knock the way I had been counting down to making it happen. The search warrant covered the entire duplex. It took less than 20 minutes to find what mattered. Under the bathroom sink, behind a box of cleaning supplies, the deputies located a lockbox. Inside 3 bottles of the same sedative the toxicology had identified. A prepaid burner phone with no contacts saved, and a single sheet of cream-colored stationery with handwritten dosing instructions. Monogram stationery. She wrote the instructions to poison my wife on paper with her own initials embossed at the top. CP in gold on cream stock. The handwriting detailed which pills to substitute. the timing window for each dose, and a note at the bottom that Caldwell read to me over the phone. If she asks questions, tell her the doctor changed the dosage. Caldwell photographed everything in place before bagging it.
Then she sat across from Jolene at the kitchen table. The duplex smelled like stale cigarettes and whatever cleaning product someone uses when they've stopped caring.
Whether the place looks lived in, and read her rights a second time. "This is Celeste Prescott's handwriting," Caldwell said, holding the stationery inside the evidence bag. "Her initials are embossed at the top. You want to tell me this was your idea?" "No," Jolene said. "It was never my idea. She called me in August and said she needed help with her mother-in-law. I didn't know what that meant until I got
Yeah,
here."
that's why I like this.
Caldwell told me Jolene's voice was flat, not defiant, not remorseful. Just the resigned monotone of a person who had been carrying a weight she knew was too heavy and had decided to set it down the fastest way she could. They moved her to the county vehicle. Confronted with the prior case in Pinal County and the physical evidence now cataloged in 6 separate bags, Jolene waived her right to counsel and gave a preliminary statement right there in the back seat. What kind of person searches court records for someone who has already been caught drugging an elderly woman and then calls that person for help? Celeste did. Jolene told Caldwell that Celeste had found her through the nursing board's public disciplinary records. She had looked up the details of the Saguaro Ridge case, found Jolene's name, and contacted her directly. She said nobody got hurt last time and nobody would get hurt this time either. "She gave me the pills," Jolene said. "She told me what to say if the pharmacy called back. She wrote down when to give them and how much. I just did what she asked. The plan was never mine." Caldwell asked about the pharmacy call, the one from the unregistered number that had authorized the medication change under Dr. Farrell's name. Jolene confirmed it. She made the call from the burner phone using a script Celeste had written out. She read it, word for word, gave the doctor's DEA number that Celeste had provided, and hung up. The entire call took less than 2 minutes. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to Caldwell relay all of this with the methodical precision of someone building a case file in real time. Every sentence Jolene spoke was another beam in the structure Boyd would present to the court. Every detail confirmed what the documents had already shown. Celeste had not improvised. She had engineered. Caldwell's final text came at 6:58 a.m.
If I got extra fried bread, I would have.
Ballard in custody. Full cooperation. Names, dates, pharmacy script, everything. Moving to secondary target now. Secondary target. That was my daughter-in-law. In 2 hours, she would be sitting at her desk in a real estate office in Scottsdale, and Adrian Caldwell would walk through the front door with handcuffs and every word Jolene Ballard had just spoken. Garrett pulled into the driveway at 8:46, with Lily and Owen still in pajamas in the back seat. Lily asked me why she was having pancakes at Grandpa's house on a school day, and I told her Grandma wanted company. The last easy lie I would ever have to tell. 14 minutes later, Caldwell's team walked into Southwest Premier Realty in Tempe. I wasn't there. Everything I know about the next 12 minutes came from Caldwell's report and the statement of a colleague who watched it happen from 3 desks away. Celeste was mid-call when Caldwell and 2 deputies entered the open plan office. She looked up, saw the badges, and did what she had always done when the world didn't match the version she had constructed. She smiled. "There's obviously been some kind of mistake," Celeste said, setting the phone down gently. "I'm happy to come in and clear this up. You really don't need to do this here." Caldwell read the charges. Elder abuse, conspiracy to administer controlled substances to a vulnerable adult, guardianship fraud. Every word landed in the silence of an office where a dozen agents sat motionless at their desks, watching the top-producing broker at Southwest Premier learn that her career was ending in the middle of a Monday morning. Celeste held the smile until Caldwell said one sentence. Your associate Jolene Ballard was taken into custody 3 hours ago. She's been cooperative. The smile dropped. Not gradually, all at once. Like a circuit breaker tripping. Whatever script Celeste had been running in her head for this contingency did not include Jolene talking first. I want my attorney, she said. I'm not saying another word. The handcuffs clicked in an office so quiet you could hear the air conditioning cycle. I wasn't there when they put the cuffs on her. I was home, making pancakes. And I think that is exactly where I was supposed to be. In a kitchen, with flour on the counter and 2 grandchildren arguing about syrup while their grandmother stood at the stove, steady enough to flip pancakes for the first time in weeks. Lorraine's hands didn't shake. The edges came out slightly burned the way they always did. And Lily told her they were perfect. Boyd called at 10:30. Dismissed with prejudice, he said. I could hear the controlled satisfaction in his voice. The sound of a man who had built a case in 9 days and watched it hold. Judge Whitfield didn't even need oral arguments. He read the fraud evidence in chambers and killed the petition. Lorraine's autonomy is fully restored.
Hello.
It can never be refiled.
Awesome
Judge
stuff.
Whitfield
Hello.
was a
Thank you for
senior
the
family court judge in Maricopa
110.
County. The kind of man who had seen enough
110
fraudulent guardianship
consecutively
filings to
watched
recognize
live
one on sight.
streams.
Boyd told me later that Whitfield had written a single note in the margin of his ruling filing, constitutes fraud upon this court. I hung up and looked through the kitchen doorway. Lorraine was holding a drawing Lily had brought from school. A crayon house with a garden and stick figures holding hands. Lorraine held it up to the window light like it was the most important document she had seen in her life. She didn't know the guardianship was dead. She didn't need to know yet. She just needed to stand in her own kitchen and look at her granddaughter's drawing without anyone telling her she wasn't competent enough to make her own decisions. My son filed for divorce from the woman he had loved for 9 years on the same day she was charged with poisoning his mother. He did it in the same courthouse where she had tried to steal Lorraine's freedom. The family court, given the criminal charges, granted Garrett emergency sole custody of both children within hours. He called from the courthouse steps. His voice was cracked but steady. The way a weld looks rough on the surface but holds when you test the joint. It's done, Dad. Divorce filed. Emergency
Yeah, I
custody
unbandaged.
granted.
I
Both
unbandaged.
kids,
I unbandaged
effective
like
immediately.
5 minutes
The kids
after I
are
did it.
safe. Come home, son. Your mother's waiting. The woman who had filed for guardianship over
The
Lorraine
gurgling sound.
now had no legal right to see her own children without court supervision. The complete inversion of control took 10 days. That evening, all of us sat in the same kitchen for the first time in over a month. Lorraine, Garrett, Lily, Owen, and me. Nobody mentioned Celeste. Nobody mentioned the courthouse. Owen ate 3 pancakes left over from breakfast and fell asleep on Garrett's lap. Lily showed Lorraine another drawing, and Lorraine taped it to the refrigerator next to a grocery list she had written herself that morning. The first list she had written in her own hand since before I left for Las Cruces. But the criminal trial was still months away, and Celeste's defense attorney had already filed notice that she intended to fight every single charge. 5 months is a long time to sit with the truth and wait for a room full of strangers to decide whether it matters. Celeste's defense attorney had promised a fight, and when the trial finally opened in a wood-paneled courtroom that smelled like old polish and recycled air, he delivered one. Marcus Hale was a sharp-featured litigator from a downtown Phoenix firm who specialized in making guilty people sound reasonable. He stood before the jury in a dark suit and laid out a version of events so clean it almost sparkled. What you'll hear from the prosecution is a story about a villain, he said. What the evidence will show is a daughter-in-law who stepped up when no one else would, who managed medications, drove to appointments, and checked in every single day while her father-in-law was 250 miles away fixing power lines. He paused for effect.
The state wants you to believe that family caregiving is a crime. We'll show you it was anything but.
Celeste sat at the defense table in a navy blazer, with her hands folded and her expression perfectly composed. The same controlled calm she had worn the night she served pot roast and mapped my cell coverage. I sat in the gallery 10 feet behind her and gripped the bench hard enough to feel the wood grain pressing into my fingertips. He was good. I will give him that. If I hadn't lived through it, I might have believed him myself. How do you sit 10 feet from the woman who poisoned your wife and listen to her lawyer call it love? You sit still. You breathe. You trust that the truth is louder than any opening statement. And you wait for the prosecutor to stand up. ADA Diane Rowan was a 15-year veteran of elder abuse cases from the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. She spoke to juries the way a teacher speaks to a class, clear, patient, and impossible to misunderstand. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She started with the toxicology. Voluntary care, she said, holding the lab report so the jury could see the numbers, does not produce lorazepam levels 3 times the therapeutic threshold in a patient who was never prescribed lorazepam. She moved to the pharmacy records, the sealed copies Ramona had provided, showing the unauthorized medication switch called in from an unregistered number. Voluntary care does not require a phone call from a burner phone impersonating a physician to change a patient's prescription without her knowledge. She played the camera footage on the courtroom monitor. The grainy green-gray image of a woman crossing the yard at 4:03 a.m., entering through the kitchen door with a foil bag. The courtroom drew a collective breath. Voluntary care does not happen at 4 in the morning in a garage with an unlicensed nurse handing over sedatives. Then the guardianship petition, the forged signature, the highway corridor study. And voluntary care does not require forging a signature on a legal document filed 2 weeks before a federal project would multiply the value of the victim's property. Each piece landed the way Boyd had designed it to, in sequence, each one reinforcing the last, until the voluntary care narrative lay in pieces on the courtroom floor. If you ever have to watch a doctor admit on a witness stand that he took cash from a stranger to see your wife, and that his carelessness gave someone the doorway to replace her medication, you will understand why I gripped that bench hard enough to leave marks in the wood. Dr. Farrell took the stand that afternoon. He confirmed every detail from his sworn statement. The referral fee, the legitimate prescription he had written, and his denial of the pharmacy call. His hands gripped the witness stand railing the entire time. I prescribed amlodipine, he said, a standard blood pressure medication. The pharmacy received a call changing that prescription to lorazepam. That call did not come from my office. I did not authorize it. Hale cross-examined him on the referral fee, trying to paint him as a co-conspirator rather than a negligent doctor. Farrell held. His phone records confirmed no outgoing call to the pharmacy. His prescribing log matched what he had sworn. Hale sat down without landing a blow. As Farrell stepped down, Rowan stood. Your Honor, the state has one more witness. One who was present when this plan was designed, and who will testify to exactly whose idea it was. Behind me. I heard Celeste's chair scrape backward. Just an inch. The first involuntary movement she had made all day. 5 months of composure broken by a single sentence. Because she knew exactly who Rowan meant. Jolene Ballard was about to walk into this courtroom and say everything Celeste had spent 5 months praying she would never say. Jolene Ballard walked into the courtroom in a county-issued jumpsuit with her hands cuffed in front of her. She moved to the witness stand the way someone walks to a confession booth, head down, hands folded. Not a single glance toward the defense table where the woman who put her there sat with her jaw locked tight. She was sworn in. Rowan asked her to describe how she came to be involved. She called me the second week of August, Jolene said. Her voice was flat and measured, the same resigned tone Caldwell had described from the morning of the arrest. She said she had a situation with her mother-in-law, and she needed someone with medical experience who understood how these things work. She found my name in the county court records from my prior case. August. Weeks before I had even left for Las Cruces. The whole operation was designed before Celeste ever served that pot roast or mapped my cell coverage. She had recruited her accomplice while Lorraine and I were still eating dinner together every night, unaware that the woman sitting across the Sunday table was already planning how to take everything we had. Rowan walked Jolene through each detail. The sedatives handed over in a Ziploc bag in a Starbucks parking lot on Baseline Road. The dosing schedule written on monogrammed stationery. The scripted pharmacy call made from a burner phone using a doctor's credentials Celeste had provided. The cover story, if anyone asked, Jolene was a home health aide hired through an agency. A Starbucks parking lot. That is where my wife's poisoning was set in motion. Between two parked cars, in broad daylight, with a bag of pills and a handshake between college roommates who had known each other for 15 years. Hale stood for cross-examination. Miss Ballard, you're testifying under a plea agreement that reduces your own sentence. Isn't that correct? Yes. So you have a personal incentive to tell this jury whatever the prosecution wants to hear. I have an incentive to tell the truth, Jolene said. And everything I've said is still true whether I get 5 years or 15. Hale pressed harder on her prior conviction, on her credibility, on the reliability of a cooperating witness. Jolene answered every question with flat, specific detail. Dates, times, locations, the color of the Ziploc bag, the make of Celeste's car in the parking lot. The things a liar forgets and a witness remembers because she was there. Then Celeste broke. It happened during Jolene's description of the pharmacy call script. Celeste leaned toward Hale and whispered something. He shook his head. She whispered again, more urgently. He put his hand on her arm, and then she did what she had avoided for the entire trial. She turned around in her chair and looked directly at me. I expected rage. I expected the cold contempt of a woman who believed she was smarter than everyone in the room. What I saw was smaller than both. She looked afraid, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, just the flat recognition that the woman who had poisoned my wife was finally looking at someone who could not be manipulated. Lorraine leaned close and whispered, "Don't look away. She needs to see that we're still here." I didn't look away. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. I had spent 10 days building the case. Celeste had spent weeks planning the crime. And 12 strangers needed a single afternoon to see through all of it. The foreman stood with a folded paper. The clerk read the counts. Guilty on deliberate elder abuse through administration of a controlled substance. Guilty on guardianship fraud. Guilty on conspiracy to seize property through fraudulent legal instruments. 3 counts. 3 words. Each one landing in the silent courtroom like a door closing. Garrett sat beside me with his shoulder pressed against mine. He didn't move when the verdicts were read. He didn't speak. Sentencing came days later. 8 years. Minimum 6 served. Full restitution of all legal and medical costs. And a permanent restraining order 1,000 feet from Lorraine, from the grandchildren, and from the Prescott property. The woman who had schemed to control my wife's autonomy through a courtroom was now barred from coming within a quarter mile of the family she had tried to exploit. 8 years. She had planned the whole thing in less than 8 weeks. They led Celeste out through the side door. She didn't look back. Not at Garrett, not at me. Not at the empty gallery seats where her colleagues might have sat if any of them had come. The door clicked shut, and the room went very quiet. Lorraine reached over and took my hand. No tremor. Her grip was steady and warm, the way it had been for 41 years before someone tried to take that from her. Neither of us said a word for a long time. Outside, Garrett was waiting on the courthouse steps. He looked at me and said quietly, "I kept waiting to feel something when they read the verdict. I just feel tired." I put my hand on his shoulder. "That's enough for today. The strangest part of winning is how quiet it gets afterward. No deadlines, no warrants,
And for you.
no evidence to catalog at 2 in the morning.
5.
Just the ordinary sound of a house trying to remember what normal feels like. Rebuilding turned out to be slower than fighting, and quieter, and harder in ways I hadn't expected. Boyd came by the house a few days after sentencing. He set a folder on the kitchen table and walked me through the final accounting, the way he had walked me through the legal strategy 10 months earlier. Precise. And without a wasted word. 12 acres, retirement accounts, life insurance. All of it exactly where it was before she started, he said. Not a single document was executed under the fraudulent guardianship.
Jack.
You caught it in time. Then he told me something I hadn't known. Celeste's petition had been filed just 11 days before the court deadline that would have made the guardianship filings legally sufficient to authorize a property transfer. 11 days. If I had stayed in Las Cruces one more week, if the crew boss hadn't released me early, if I
Hello
had
from
believed
Nigeria?
Garrett's phone calls,
I have not seen
a little
Odyssey.
longer. 11 days, and she would have had everything. What do I owe you? Boyd, we'll work it out. He stood and shook my hand at the door.
Because I saw
Right
Tenet
now,
in the IMAX and I
go
couldn't
sit
hear a
with your
single word
wife.
that was being said.
She's earned a
It's kind of
quiet
waste of
evening.
time, to be honest.
He also mentioned,
Don't know what was
almost
wrong with
as
the
an
audio mixing or
afterthought,
something.
that the medical board had
Oh,
ruled
no,
on
man.
Dr. Farrell
I
an
don't
ethics
know, probably need
violation for the
subtitles.
referral fee,
If I'm gonna watch
not a crime.
blockbuster
He
films
kept
like
his
that.
license. I watched his car
just wait
pull
till
down the
it's
driveway
being
for the
streamed
last
online,
time in his professional
And then
capacity,
I can, watch
and
with
stood in the
subtitles
doorway
and
for a
understand what
while,
they're saying.
listening to the silence that had replaced the urgency. If you have ever watched someone you love relearn how to trust their own body, how to
That's
walk
correct, Jack.
without
Thank you for
gripping the
5
wall,
gifted subs, thank
how
you.
to eat without checking who prepared the food, then you know that recovery is not a moment.
Thank you,
It
thank
is a
you, thank you.
season.
Thank you.
Lorraine started seeing a new physician the week
I don't
after
know how many thank
sentencing.
yous I'm supposed to say.
Supervised
About 4,
withdrawal
so it's
from the
bad luck.
sedative's lingering effects. Weekly therapy sessions at a clinic in Scottsdale. The weight came back slowly, a pound, then 2, then enough that her rings fit again instead of sliding off her fingers when she washed dishes. Some nights she still checked every lock twice before bed.
Oh yeah,
I
I saw
walked the house
Oppenheimer.
with
I
her
forgot
each
that was,
time
was that
without
Christopher
comment.
Nolan, Oppenheimer?
She would test the front door,
Completely forgot about that.
the side gate,
Yeah,
the
I saw that
kitchen
at the cinema.
deadbolt, and then look at me as if
That was
asking
good.
permission to believe they were secure. I would nod, and she would exhale, and we would go to bed. She told me after one of her therapy
Fucking hate
sessions
this
that the
old street
therapist
roundabout now.
said
It's
the
not even a
nightmares
roundabout,
might
it's such a joke,
continue
man.
for a while. Lorraine said she told the
Such a
woman she
joke.
had been having nightmares since August at least. Now she woke up and knew they were over. Recovery was not a straight line. There were mornings she was steady, and afternoons she was not.
It was coming
But every
home,
week
no,
the
I've
good
got to pay
hours
for it.
outnumbered the bad ones by a
No,
little
pay
more.
home.
And by early fall, she was walking to the garden
That's
and
not
back on
coming
her
home
own,
anymore, is it?
without pausing at the door to gather her balance. Garrett moved back into his childhood bedroom during the divorce proceedings. Lily and Owen came with
You
him.
can't follow.
The
Just
house
reload
was
the
louder
page and
than
try
it had
again.
been in years.
Just refresh.
Cereal bowls on the counter at 7 in the morning. Cartoons from the living room. One's shoes left in the hallway where someone would trip on them every single night. It was the best kind of noise. One Saturday morning in October, without discussion. Garrett carried a toolbox out to the yard and looked up at the section of roof the ice storm had damaged back when all of this started. I walked out with a second hammer and a bag of shingles. Neither of us said a word. We just climbed the ladder. A damaged roof does not care who broke it or why. It just needs two people willing to climb up and fix it one shingle at a time. That is about as close to a philosophy of forgiveness as I will ever get. We worked side by side for hours. The old shingles were curled and darkened from months of Arizona sun. The tar paper was gritty under my work gloves. From the rooftop, I could see the full 12 acres stretching east toward the corridor where the highway would come. The land that had nearly destroyed our family. Now the view we shared while putting it back together. Garrett spoke once, quietly, without looking up from the nail he was setting. I'm sorry I didn't see it. I didn't tell him it was all right, because it was not a question of all right. I nodded and kept hammering. Some things do not need words. They need time and a shared roof to fix.
I haven't heard that.
We came down at sunset, tools on our shoulders, sawdust in our hair. Lorraine was standing at the back door, steady on her feet, no hand on the frame. She said dinner was ready, and she had set 5 places. Then she smiled. The highway letter came today. The letter was 2 pages, single-spaced, from the Arizona Department of Transportation. I read it at the kitchen table after dinner while Lorraine dried the dishes, and Lily drew pictures on the floor behind us. It confirmed everything Celeste had known before any of us. The federal highway expansion would run along the eastern corridor bordering our property. And the county assessor had already revised our land value upward. $912,000. That was the new number. 2 East acres of scrub desert I had paid off over 2 decades ago.
Abominable.
Now worth more than I had earned in my entire career as a lineman. That was the price Celeste had put on Lorraine's mind.
I think it's an old meme.
Her freedom and her life.
Well, I know
Every
it is,
pill,
but I can't
every
exactly
forged
remember
signature,
what it is.
every 4 a.m. visit. All of it calibrated to capture a number printed on a government letter that was now sitting on my kitchen table next to a salt shaker and a glass of water.
How much?
Lorraine asked from the sink. More than enough to understand why she did what she did,
To be fair,
I said. Not enough to make it make sense. The letter invited us to an informational meeting for affected property owners.
I was very close to them.
I folded
didn't
it
get them,
and
but I was
set
very
it on the
close to them.
counter. Over the following week, 3 development firms contacted us. The first by letter, the second by phone, the third by a man in a polo shirt who drove up the driveway in a white SUV and handed me a business card with both hands, like he was presenting a gift. What is a piece of land worth when someone tried to steal your wife's mind to get it? Is it worth more now, or is it worth something money stopped being able to measure? The third developer offered $950,000 and said he could close in 30 days. I thanked him, told him I would talk to my wife, and walked him back to his SUV. He probably thought I was negotiating. I not. That evening, I set the 3 business cards on the kitchen counter next to the ADOT letter and sat down across from Lorraine. She looked at the cards and then at me. You already know what I'm going to say, she said. I do, but I want you to say it. Nobody is making decisions about this land without you ever again.
Because you like it
She picked up the business cards one by one, read each name, and set them back down in a neat row. Then she looked at me with an expression I have learned to recognize over 41 years of marriage. The one that means she has thought about something carefully and arrived at the answer before I finished asking the question. Call Boyd, she said. Tell him we're not selling. And tell him to send these gentlemen a polite letter explaining that the property is not on the market.
I always get those 2 bands
You're
mixed
sure?
up, to be honest.
I've been sure since the day you came home from Las Cruces.
I've not really listened
If
to either
someone
of
ever
those bands
offers
ever in
you a
my
number
entire
for the
life for
place
some
where you
reason.
raised your
Neither of my
children
parents are
and
into
buried
them.
your dog and watched your wife plant
I
tomatoes
don't know
every
why. I
spring,
never ever listened to
remember
them
that the
Rolling
number
Stones.
only means something if the place
It's one of
does
those bands I
not.
just never fucking
Our place meant
never
everything.
ever listened to.
It meant the porch
She was in
where
the
Lorraine
Beatles.
and I drank coffee
No, the
every
Beatles
morning
actually
for
a band.
30 years.
From Birmingham.
It meant the garage where I kept the camera that caught the woman in
It was
scrubs.
from BTS. Oh,
It meant the
okay.
garden that went
Mick Jagger from
untended for
BTS.
3
Oh, the
months while my
famous
wife was
Korean
too sedated
Mick
to
Jagger,
kneel
yes,
in
of
the
course.
dirt.
How could
The
I
money
forget?
was real. The offers were generous, and none of it mattered compared to standing on ground that was ours because we had chosen to keep it, not because someone had failed to steal it. On a Sunday evening in late October, Lorraine and I sat on the back porch
Roger
looking out
Daltrey.
past the garden toward the
No
open
idea,
desert.
mate. I mean, I
The
probably know
jasmine
what he
along the
looks like. I
fence
can
had
picture
finished
him, but
blooming for the season,
I
but the
don't know that music
stems
at
were
all,
still
never got into
green,
it.
holding on the way desert plants do, stubbornly, without fanfare, because giving
Never,
up
ever
is
got
not
into it,
in
ever.
their design. Lorraine leaned against my shoulder. Her weight was steady, no tremor. We don't need to sell it to prove anything,
Harry
she said
Styles. No,
quietly,
not Harry Styles, because Harry Styles
looking
is
straight
like
ahead with both
Mick
feet on
Jagger's
the ground.
reincarnation, isn't he? I
We
think
just
he
need to
idols
live
Mick
on it,
Jagger,
in peace.
allegedly.
I knew that was the last word either of us would ever say about the money.
Harry Styles.
We sat on that porch
But-
until the stars came out.
Yeah, I don't. Maybe
The
that's why I
desert was
don't
quiet.
appreciate Harry Styles.
The roof
wonderful
was
music,
fixed.
because I never listened
land
to Mick
was
Jagger's
ours.
wonderful music.
From inside the house, I could hear Lorraine's coffee maker
Is there a
cycling for the
connection?
morning. She had started setting it the night before, again. The way she used to. Back
Is it
when
Friday
tomorrow was something she looked forward
let me
to,
check.
instead of
Yes.
something she feared.
Yes, it
And
is.
somewhere down the hallway, faintly,
It's Friday.
heard her humming.
Friday.
a
Why did she go
song
to the
I had
bus
not
stop?
heard since
and
before
then get
I
in a
left for Las
car?
Cruces.
That's what I was thinking
Before
about the
any
lyrics
of it
last night. I was
started.
like,
The cold eased
get
out of
down
Mesa
to
the
the
way it always
bus
does,
stop.
slowly.
gotta catch my
Then
bus.
all at once.
I
And
see
the
my
first
friends,
morning warm enough to
and then
work
the friends are sitting
outside.
in the front seat and the back seat.
Lorraine
decide
knelt
which
in
seat
the
to take,
garden
so
bed she hadn't
she's waiting at the
touched
bus
since
stop
before any of it began.
for her friends arriving
There
in
is a
car.
particular way my wife kneels in dirt, slow,
Hello, Nathan
deliberate.
Edits.
like she is
Welcome in.
greeting an old friend she was not sure
Welcome.
she would see again.
Welcome
The
in.
first time I saw her do it that November. I had to turn away so she would not see my face. She pulled dead stalks
Maybe it
from
was
the
a
beds
surprise.
with her bare hands,
Life's full
cleared
of
the brittle
surprises.
remains of tomato plants that had dried out during
it
the months
really?
she could not tend them,
Life is just full
turned
of
the
surprises.
soil with a trowel, working the Arizona clay the
Hold
way
this
she
glass on
has
the
for
floor.
decades,
This car wanna
patient,
go?
methodical, unhurried. She did not ask for help. She did not need any. The rosemary survived. Everything else in the garden had
Why did
died
that
during
car
those 3
completely
months
miss the
of
lights?
neglect. But the
Well, the
rosemary bush sat green and stubborn against the brown
Why did
desert
no one
earth,
hoot it?
its leaves releasing
If I
oil
was
when
the car
she
behind,
brushed it with
if
her
I could
hand.
drive a car, I would have hooted
She and
it.
the rosemary had that in common.
Nice
Some
driving,
things are
mate.
harder to kill than the people trying to kill them
Completely
expect.
clueless. The guy's
I sat on the
clueless,
porch
man.
and watched her work. Her hands were steady.
Absolutely
Her balance
clueless.
was sure. She knelt and stood and knelt again without reaching for the railing or pausing
Like,
to
he's
gather
completely
herself.
unaware. He did, like, he
The
wasn't
new shingles on
doing
the
it on
roof
purpose at
above
all,
me
he was
were
just
brighter than the
completely
old
oblivious.
ones, the only visible evidence that anything had needed fixing.
You are
Opal
currently
came by
driving
on a
car.
Tuesday not long
How
after.
about you pay attention
A
to
plate
what
of
the
lemon
fuck is
bars
in front of
balanced
you?
in both hands, the way she had for
Imagine-
18 years
Imagine
before
driving a
any
car
of
and
it
looking
started.
at the road in front of you.
Lorraine held the
That's
door
fucking nuts,
open
right?
and let her in.
What an idea.
If your mother or father is taking medication you have never personally looked at,
You
Go
surprise
look at
yourself in your sleep when you
today.
might. Fucking
Do
hell.
not
I don't
trust
think I've
one
ever woken
person's
myself up
word,
like that.
not a spouse,
I just
not a
don't.
child,
I'm
not a
perfect.
caregiver who smiles when she tells you everything
I
is
do
fine.
not fork,
Look
fork,
at the bottles,
fork,
read
push
the labels,
pineapple, shake the
call
tree.
the pharmacist
Da-na-na,
yourself.
na-na,
Do not wait
na-na-na,
until you are reviewing
na-na-na.
security camera footage at 4 in the morning
I
to
do
start
not
asking
fork,
the questions
fork,
you
fork.
should have asked months ago. I have thought about this for a long time, and I want to say it plainly. Nothing that happened to our family was luck, bad or good.
Do I ever get a puncture?
Celeste made a
Don't
choice.
jinx it.
Jolene made a
Why are you
choice.
asking if I get a puncture?
But the pharmacist who flagged the
Jinxing
prescription
it.
made a choice too. The emergency physician who ran the blood panel, instead of sending Lorraine home, made a choice. Boyd filed motions on a weekend because he chose to work when he could have waited. Caldwell moved on the
Drivers on
warrants
their
in
phones,
48
probably
hours
on his
because
phone,
she
yeah.
recognized the face on the footage and chose to act on what she knew. Every outcome in this story traces back to a human being deciding what kind of person they wanted to be. The ones who chose wrong are serving time. The ones who chose right are the reason my wife is
Probably
kneeling
out
in a
his
garden on a
phone.
November morning
He's just
with
looking at his
dirt under her
telephone,
fingernails
isn't he?
and the sun on her back. That evening we sat on the porch the way we have for
phone.
30 years, coffee in hand, the desert cooling around us. The 12 acres stretching out toward a horizon that would look different once the highway came through.
Yeah,
But would
there's
still
loads
be
of glass on the road
ours.
there. Hello, Pooh Bear.
Lorraine was quiet for a long time.
I am well.
Then
How
she
are
told
you?
me something she had never said during the investigation, or the trial, or the months of
Neighbor woke me up
recovery
at 5:30
afterward.
this morning.
She had known the whole time.
Such a-
Through the shaking
such a
hands and the
Phoenix
blurred
Tuesday.
vision and the nights she checked every lock twice. Through the pills
But
she
I
swallowed
don't
because she was
say
afraid
anything
of
bad to
losing her
him.
grandchildren. Through
I
every
don't say
morning
anything
she
to him
woke up
because I
foggier
know
than the one
from
before
previous experience, if I
and wondered
start
if
having
something
like
was wrong with
animosity
her
or like bad
or
blood
with
with
the
my
world.
neighbor, it's just gonna
She
be
had
miserable.
held on
So I
because she
just fucking-
believed I would come home.
I just don't say anything.
And she believed that when I did, I would see the truth.
I just give him the benefit
I
of the
knew
doubt
you'd
and
come
carry on with
home.
my life, you know.
She said, her head resting against my shoulder. And I knew you'd know. I put my arm around her.
You don't
The
have
weight
neighbors,
was
damn, you
something
live
we
in a
shared.
detached house or some stuff.
Not something
Fucking
either
hell.
of us carried
Can you give me
alone.
some of that money?
It had always been that
You wanna-
way.
You wanna?
It would always
send
be
me
that way.
some
The light
bits?
was gold. Her hands were dirty from the garden. The roof was fixed.
I'm not burned out. No.
The
I
land
feel
was
better today,
ours.
actually.
From
Gotta push
somewhere
through
down
the
the
burnout,
hallway,
don't you, really?
I could hear
Feel
Owen
burnt out,
laughing at
fucking
something
carry
Lily
on.
had said,
Keep going, bitch.
and Garrett's voice answering them both with the steady patience of a man who had learned the hard way that the people in your house matter more than anything outside
Tits?
of it.
What do you mean tits? That's a
41
random
years ago,
thing to say.
I married a woman who plants
What do you mean,
rosemary
tits?
because she likes the way it smells when the rain comes.
Sodom.
She was safe.
I mean,
She was steady. She was home.
whatever.
I
It
came
is what
home.
it is. It's like the first time he's woken
And I
me
knew.
up, so I'm not gonna like.
And to you listening to my
if you did it all
story,
the time, I'd probably have to say
remember
something.
this.
But
I
it's
spent
first
35
of-
years climbing power poles
time
and
in a long
restoring
time.
lines after storms. And I
That's what it
thought
is.
that was the hardest work a man could do.
Few berries and thank you for
I
the
was
14
wrong.
bits.
The hardest work I ever
Biddies to
did
the
was sitting at my
titties.
own kitchen table and realizing I had trusted the wrong person with
You
the
live in a
most
semi-D, but your
important
neighbours
person
are
in
away
my
95%
life.
of the time. Fuck, you're
Don't
lucky.
make my mistake.
That is lucky, but then again,
Don't assume that because someone smiles
next
and says
person
everything
who
is
moves in
fine,
could be
check
an
the pill
issue.
bottles
I don't know.
yourself, read the
I don't want to go
labels,
straight here.
call the
I don't wanna go to
pharmacist.
Wapping, man.
ask the questions
I
nobody
really do
wants
not
to
wanna
ask.
Go to Wapping.
Because the cost
Where
of
are we going,
silence
actually?
is always higher than the cost of being wrong. This was never a revenge
we're turning
story
left
in the
here.
way people might think.
If we turn right, we go to
It was
Tower
a
Bridge.
story
I don't wanna
about
go to
paying
Tower Bridge.
attention. Every person who helped us, the
Hey, what?
pharmacist who flagged the prescription, the doctor who ran the blood work, the attorney who worked weekends,
Yeah,
the
that's the thing with
investigator
neighbours.
who
is
recognized a
it's
face. They
better the
all
devil
did
you know
one
with
simple
neighbours, I
thing.
found, because
They
you
chose to
could
look
dislike a neighbour
closer
for whatever reason,
when
and
it
then
would
they
have
move
been
and you
easier
get
to look
someone worse.
away.
So it's like
That is the lesson. Not revenge,
it's better to just keep the peace. I think.
not anger,
when it comes to neighbours.
just the
Well, just
quiet,
everyone in general, just keep the
stubborn
peace.
decision to see what is
Better to just
actually
keep the peace in
happening and
general.
act on it. I believe God put the right people in my path at the right time, and I will be grateful for that until the day I leave this earth. If this revenge story reached you today, maybe
I mean,
it
we were
reached you
kind
for
of
a
going
reason.
in this direction yesterday.
If this story
I
moved you,
really don't want to end up.
I would
in
be
fucking
honored if
Canary
you left a
Wharf again.
comment telling me what part stayed with you
Fuck
the
off.
most. Share it with someone who needs to hear
Bag
it.
of shit.
A friend, a sibling,
Told off
anyone
by the
caring
private
for an
security
aging
literally
parent.
just sitting down.
And if you
It's
haven't
nuts, man.
already, subscribe
I know I'm
so you
streaming,
don't
but
miss
like-
the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know.
Anonymous.
Some
thank you for
details
the
in this story
gift
were
to cream
fictionalized for
pie
narrative and emotional
gargle.
impact. Any resemblance to real
Cream pie
individuals
gargle.
is coincidental.
Thank you, Anonymous.
The message check on the people you love is what I hope you
How
carry
about
with
Greenwich?
you.